La 9891e séance du Conseil de sécurité est ouverte. L'ordre du jour provisoire de la présente séance est la situation au Moyen-Orient, y compris la question palestinienne. L'ordre du jour est adopté. Conformément à l'article 37 du règlement intérieur provisoire du Conseil, j'invite les représentants d'Israël et de la Libye à participer à la présente séance. Il en est ainsi décidé. Je propose que, conformément aux dispositions de son règlement intérieur provisoire et à la pratique établie en la matière, le Conseil invite Monsieur l'observateur permanent de l'État observateur de Palestine auprès de l'Organisation des Nations Unies à participer à la présente séance. Puisqu'il n'y a pas d'objection, il en est ainsi décidé. Conformément à l'article 39 du règlement intérieur provisoire du Conseil, j'invite les intervenants suivants à participer à la présente séance. Monsieur Volker Türk, haut-commissaire des Nations Unies aux droits de l'homme, et Monsieur le Dr Younes Al-Khatib, président de la Société du Croissant Rouge palestinien. Il en est ainsi décidé. Le Conseil de sécurité va maintenant aborder l'examen du point 2 de l'ordre du jour. Je donne la parole
I now give
à
the
Monsieur le
floor
Haut-Commissaire
to
des Nations Unies aux
the
droits de
United
l'homme,
Nations
Monsieur
High
Volker.
Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Volker Türk.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
it pains me to brief this Council once again on the catastrophic suffering of people in Gaza. The temporary relief of the ceasefire, which gave Palestinians a moment to breathe, has been shattered. Since 1 March, Israeli military operations have killed more than 1,200 Palestinians, including at least 320 children, according to the Ministry of Health in Gaza. And bombardments continue of residential buildings, tents, hospitals and schools, including places where Palestinians have been ordered to move. There was no let-up, even as Palestinian families celebrated Eid. I'm appalled by the recent killings of 15 medical personnel and humanitarian aid workers, which raise further concerns over the commission of war crimes by the Israeli military. There must be an independent, prompt, and thorough investigation into the killings, and those responsible for any violation of international law must be held to account. The Israeli military continues to strike camps for people who have been displaced numerous times, who have nowhere safe to go. The Israeli military also continues to force civilians to move. Half of Gaza is now under mandatory evacuation orders or has been declared a no-go zone. These orders fail to comply with the requirements of international humanitarian law. Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups continue to launch indiscriminate rockets from Gaza into Israel in breach of international humanitarian law. I'm also deeply concerned about the fate and well-being of Israeli hostages still held in Gaza. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
cela fait maintenant un mois
it has
qu'Israël
now
bloque
been a month
complètement
since
l'entrée
Israel
de toute
imposed a
aide
complete
humanitaire
blockade on
et
vital
denrées essentielles, y
humanitarian
compris la
aid and
nourriture,
supplies,
l'eau,
including food,
l'électricité,
water,
le carburant
electricity,
et les médicaments,
fuel and medicines,
portant ainsi
thus harming
atteinte à toute la
the
population de
entire
Gaza.
population of Gaza.
Le blocus ainsi que le
The
siège de Gaza
blockade and
constituent une
siege
forme de
imposed on
punition
Gaza amount
collective.
to collective
Et il pourrait
punishment
également s'agir
and may
du
also
fait
amount to
d'affamer des
the use
civils
of
comme méthode de
starvation
guerre.
as a method of
Au
war.
1er avril,
As of
le
the 1st
Programme
of
alimentaire
April,
mondial
the World
s'est
Food
vu
Programme
contraint de
shut
fermer ses 25
its
boulangeries
25
à travers
bakeries
Gaza,
across
privant
Gaza,
de ce fait plusieurs familles de
leaving
pain.
many families
Les
without
tensions
access to
sociales
bread.
résultent
Social
des privations
tensions
alimentaires
over food
sont
shortages
palpables.
are palpable.
Cela s'ajoute aux allégations
alongside
d'usage excessif
reports of
de la
the
force
excessive
par
use
la
of
police
force
locale.
by the local police.
Comme avant le cessez-le-feu, l'ordre social
We are
s'effondre
witnessing
à
a
nouveau
return to
sous
the
nos yeux.
breakdown of social order that
Je
preceded the
suis alarmé
ceasefire.
par les déclarations
I am alarmed
inflammatoires
by the
de
inflammatory
hauts
rhetoric
responsables
by
israéliens
senior Israeli
concernant le
officials
fait
around
de saisir,
seizing,
diviser et
dividing,
contrôler le
and
territoire
controlling
de la
territory
bande de Gaza, ainsi que
from the Gaza,
transférer les
of the Gaza
Palestiniens
Strip
en
and
dehors de
also
Gaza.
transferring
Tout
Palestinians
cela
outside Gaza.
suscite de graves
This raises
inquiétudes
grave
quant à la
concerns
commission de crimes
about the
internationaux
Commission of
et va à
International
l'encontre
Crimes
du principe
and runs
fondamental
counter to
du
the
droit
fundamental
international sur
principle of
l'acquisition du
international
territoire par
law
la force.
against the acquisition of
Dans la
territory by
résolution
force. In Resolution
2735 adoptée en
2735,
juin dernier,
adopted
ce
in
Conseil
June,
a rejeté
this
toute
Council
tentative de
rejected
changement
any
démographique
attempt at
ou
demographic
territorial
or
dans la bande de
territorial
Gaza,
change in the
y
Gaza
compris
Strip,
tout acte visant à
including
réduire
any
le
actions that reduce
territoire
the
de Gaza.
territory of Gaza.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
the situation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is also extremely alarming. Israeli operations in the North and West Bank have killed hundreds of people, destroyed entire refugee camps and makeshift medical sites, and displaced over 40,000 Palestinians. The announcement that residents must not return to their homes for a year raises serious concerns about long-term mass displacement. Since 7 October 2023, my office has verified that state and settler violence has killed 909 Palestinians across the West Bank, including 191 children and 5 people with disabilities, some of which may amount to extrajudicial and other unlawful killings. In the same period, 51 Israelis, including 15 women and 4 children, were killed in alleged Palestinian attacks or armed clashes, 33 in the West Bank and 18 in Israel. Illegal settlement expansion continues unabated as some Israeli ministers advocate for Israeli sovereignty in the occupied territory. Dozens of Palestinian herding and farming communities have been forced to leave their homes and their ancestral lands, while restrictions on movement have paralyzed the economy and are shredding the social fabric. While hundreds of Palestinian detainees were released during the ceasefire, hundreds more people have been arrested and detained. Within Israel, the severe crackdown on civic space, including against organizations defending the human rights of Palestinians, is also alarming. Monsieur le Président, nothing can justify the horrific attacks committed against Israeli communities on 7 October 2023, and nothing can justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. According to the Palestinian Ministry of Health, Israeli military operations since 7 October 2023 have killed more than 50,400 Palestinians in Gaza and injured more than 114,000 people. I urge the immediate restoration of the ceasefire and unimpeded humanitarian access throughout Gaza. I warn again that there is a high and increasing risk that atrocity crimes are being committed in the occupied Palestinian territory. Under the Geneva Conventions, states have an obligation to act when a serious violation of international humanitarian law has been committed. Under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, state parties have the responsibility to act to prevent such a crime when risk becomes apparent. I urge all those with influence to ensure the protection of civilians as a matter of absolute priority. It is essential that there is full accountability for all violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. All hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. All those arbitrarily detained must also be released. Israel must refrain from any acts amounting to forcible transfer of Gaza's population. The last 18 months of violence have made abundantly clear that there is no military path out of this crisis. The only way forward is a political settlement based on 2 states living side by side in equal dignity and rights, in line with United Nations resolutions and international law. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Merci, Monsieur le Haut-Commissaire.
I thank the High Commissioner for his briefing.
Je donne à présent la parole à
I now give the floor to Dr. Younes Al-Khatib,
président de la Société du Croissant-Rouge palestinien.
President of the Palestine Red Crescent Society.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, members of the Security Council. Attacks on aid workers must end. Perpetrators must be held to account. This was the message from Joyce Musaya, Assistant Secretary General of OCHA, during yesterday's meeting of the Security Council. We cannot but echo that important message and emphasize the critical need for the Security Council to do all it can to protect those selfless volunteers and staff whose main mission is to save lives during the darkest times of conflict and human suffering. Last Saturday, we witnessed one of the darkest moments yet in a conflict that has shocked our common humanity to the core. Many appalling records have been broken in this war in Gaza. The most number of aid workers killed in any single conflict. The number of children killed. The number of attacks on health workers and facilities. The extent of destruction of civilian infrastructures and homes, and the list goes on. Last Saturday, a PRCS mission coordinated and accompanied by the UN OCHA uncovered a mass grave where 15 first responders, including 8 members of the Palestine Red Crescent Society, paramedics, 6 members of the civil defense, and 1 United Nations officer were killed and buried. They were killed while on mission to save the lives, following reports of civilian casualties in the area of Tal Sultan in Rafah. We have documented the timelines of the mission, of the 3 ambulances, the communication between the first team and the dispatch, the time when we lost contact with the second and third team, and what the first team had witnessed when they went back to the scene and communicated it to the dispatch center. We have also documented the intense firing that the dispatch could hear while the VHF equipment were on. When the team member Asad al-Nasasra reported that they are being fired upon and that a number of colleagues were injured, that same team member is still missing, and we have no information on his fate. We call on the Israeli occupation forces to provide information on the fate and whereabouts of Assad. It's worth noting also that during the communication with the team, the dispatch could hear a conversation in Hebrew between the Israeli forces and the team, meaning some were alive, still alive, when they were under the control of the Israeli forces. Many council members have called for a thorough and independent investigation. We reiterate this call and believe this is the minimum the Security Council and the international community should demand on the way to hold those responsible to account. Mr. President, Excellencies, this is not the first incident where PRCS and UN aid workers and others have been killed while on mission to provide relief and life-saving assistance. We have lost 36 PRCS colleagues before this horrible incident. We also have been documenting and sharing with partners and member states all violations against the PRCS teams, facilities, and missions. Mr. President, it has been a whole month since Israel resumed fighting and enforced total closure on Gaza, including total blockade in all aid entering Gaza. 2 million people in Gaza are denied food, water, medicine, shelter, and electricity, in addition to the psychological trauma they have been enduring for the past 18 months. In an Israeli strategy of collective punishment to achieve war goals, this is a grave violation of international humanitarian law. During the 6 weeks of ceasefire implementation, humanitarian agencies, including PRCS, worked tirelessly to bring in relief, to bring back some level of basic services to the people in Gaza, including health and education services, only to see conditions worsening as violence returns to haunt people of Gaza even more brutally than before. Mr. President, Excellencies, many member states, organizations, and experts presented recommendations and action points throughout this conflict. Allow me to reiterate the following points. 1, we urge the Council to support the call for an independent and thorough investigation of this atrocious crime and hold those responsible to account. 2, we call on the Council members, individually and collectively, to take action to ensure respect for international humanitarian law. 3, enforce existing mechanisms and tools at the disposal of the member states to ensure protection of humanitarian and aid workers and end impunity. 4, we call on the Security Council and on the whole international community to spare no effort to return to the ceasefire and to the end of violence immediately. 5, we call for the immediate resumption of aid delivery and the opening of borders crossings. The souls of Mustafa, Izzuddin, Saleh, Rifat, Muhammad Bahlul, Muhammad Al-Hili, Ashraf Ra'id, are asking for justice. Can you hear them? Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie Monsieur Al-Khatib
I
pour son
thank Mr.
exposé.
Al-Khatib for his briefing.
Et je donne maintenant la parole aux membres du
I now give
Conseil
the
qui
floor to those
souhaitent
council
faire une
members who wish to
déclaration.
make statements.
Je donne la parole
I give the
à
floor
Monsieur le représentant
to
permanent de
the permanent
l'Algérie.
representative of Algeria.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
At the outset, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to High Commissioner Volker Turk and to Dr. Yunus Al-Khatib for their sobering briefings. Their words are a stark reminder of the immense suffering endured by the Palestinian people and the barbarity they are subjected to. This is a collective punishment. This is a war crime. Algeria requested this meeting because we firmly believe that this Council must speak with clarity and strength. This Council must fully embrace its responsibilities. This Council must ensure the implementation of its own decision. Failure to do so will result in the loss of any remaining authority, any remaining legitimacy. And the world, our constituency, will no longer respect neither the Council nor its deliberation. Mr. President, the people of Gaza are facing unthinkable hardship. Israel, the occupying power, is responsible for Gaza becoming the deadliest conflict for aid workers, with more 400 killed. The deadliest conflict for journalists, with 209 journalists killed. The deadliest conflict for medical staff, with over 1,060 workers killed. And also, the deadliest conflict for children, with more than 17,000 children killed. These people, these innocent civilians, deserve justice. To save life, we must put an immediate end to the ongoing onslaught. And our resolution 2735 should be fully implemented without delay. Mr. President, since the resumption of the Israeli offensive on March 18, over 1,030 Palestinians have been killed daily. Over 103 Palestinians have been killed daily, and more than 223 injured daily. Yes, killing became the daily routine of Gazans, while the international community watches a genocide unfold live. And like all of us here, it remained passive. This morning, Israeli airstrikes targeted a school sheltering displaced people, killing dozens of civilians. Yesterday, the bombing of the UNRWA clinic in Jabalia by the Israeli forces resulted in the death of 22 people. The search of bodies after this massacre has been heartbreaking. with children identified only by their clothes. Red blouse for Abu Saada, brown blouse for Alian, the youngest of these children. Was a baby 2 weeks old. As if the killing was not enough. For more than a month now, Israeli forces have literally blocked any humanitarian aid from entering Gaza. According to UNICEF, over 1 million people are starving to death inside the Gaza Strip. What is happening in Gaza is absolute horror, and such criminal behavior of the Israeli authorities must not go unchallenged. Mr. President, while we focus on the suffering in Gaza, we must not overlook the atrocities occurring in the West Bank. There also, the Israeli war machine has spared no part of the West Bank from its brutality. The figures of destruction, dispossession, annexation, arrestation, forced displacement, and finally, assassinations continue to rise daily. Israeli officials have publicly lauded their efforts, and they have made it clear that they will not allow the Palestinian Authority to effectively control the West Bank. In 2024, last year, the Israeli occupation forces seized 46 square kilometers of land, of Palestinian land in the West Bank. And settlement policy continued unabated, with settlements being described as the protector of the heart of Israel. Furthermore, Israeli officials have repeatedly assaulted Al-Aqsa Mosque, challenging the historical and legal status quo and the Hashemite custodianship of the holy sites. We strongly condemn all these actions. To conclude, Mr. President, history has taught us that no force can uproot a people from their land. And the Palestinian people will not be displaced. They will remain on their land. And with the support of all those who cherish freedom, peace, and justice. They will establish their independent state with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital. I thank you.
Je remercie Monsieur le représentant permanent
I
de l'Algérie
thank
pour
the
sa
permanent
déclaration et je
representative
donne
of
la parole
Algeria
à
for
Monsieur le
that statement. I
représentant
now
permanent de
give
la
the floor
Slovénie.
to the permanent representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I also thank the briefers today. Mr. President, if the walls of this chamber, the blue and gold tapestries with the symbols of faith, hope, and charity could speak, they would surely have many stories to share. Perhaps they would choose silence over words for many unfulfilled commitments made here. Perhaps they would cite resolutions of the Council never fully implemented. Perhaps quote statements of briefers shocking us with their accounts of the situation and suffering of civilians on the ground. Whatever those words would entail, they would point to one direction: erosion. What we see in Gaza is erosion of humanity. We are appalled by the Israeli attacks on humanitarian workers in Gaza. The UN, ICRC, Palestine Red Crescent Society, UNRWA, FAO, Médecins Sans Frontières, ICRC, Nasser Hospital. Humanitarian workers in these institutions have been under fire since the hostilities resumed. We are shocked by the latest attacks on the humanitarian convoy, killing 15 medical and humanitarian workers. Dr. Al-Khatib, we offer our condolences to you and to the families and friends of those who have been killed. We cannot choose to believe that these were simply mistakes. Slovenia condemns all attacks on all humanitarian, medical, and UN personnel. They must be protected and supported in their mission at all times. We call on Israel to re-establish humanitarian notification and deconfliction mechanism. We call for an end to these attacks. Intentionally directing attacks against personnel involved in a humanitarian assistance mission is a war crime and must be prosecuted accordingly. What we see is erosion of protection of civilians. We condemn the killings of civilians, particularly women and children, since the collapse of the ceasefire. We hear from humanitarian organizations that food and fuel are running out. We call on Israel to immediately lift the siege on Gaza and ensure safe and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance at scale. We underline that starvation as a method of war is a war crime. We are appalled by the issuance of new evacuation orders in Gaza. We caution against the implementation of the so-called humanitarian bubbles and the militarization of aid in Gaza. We once again appeal to Israel to reverse the implementation of legislation against UNRWA. Colleagues, what we see is erosion of respect for international law. International law, particularly international humanitarian law and human rights law, must be respected by all. We call for impartial and thorough investigations of all incidents involving humanitarian workers. We ask the results of these investigations to be shared with the Council. Violations taking place on and after 7 October must be prosecuted. Only accountability will ensure non-repetition. Ongoing expansion of the Gaza war and the operations in the West Bank must stop. We are appalled by the situation in West Bank marked by settler violence, destruction, demolition, movement restrictions, displacement, and repeating violations of the status quo of the holy sites. Occupation must end as ordered by the ICJ. We reject any seizures of Palestinian land and forced displacement of Palestinians. We emphasize that Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem form an indivisible whole of the Palestinian state where governance must be under the Palestinian Authority. What we see in Israel and Palestine is erosion of peace and security. So let us repeat, there is no military solution to any conflict, and neither for conflicts in the Middle East. More war does not bring more peace. Not to Israel, not to Palestine, not to the region, nor the globe. With each passing day, the region is less secure and future is more unstable. We once again call for an end of Israeli occupations in Gaza and the West Bank and for an end of attacks on Israel. We call on Israel and Hamas to return to the agreement made in line with the Resolution 2735 with the support of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States. Ceasefire must be restored. Hostages must be released. Aid must flow and dialogue must prevail. The only path to lasting peace can be the one of diplomacy. The only solution for ensuring lasting peace is the two-state solution endorsed by this Council. Mr. President, I recall the briefing of the Palestine Red Crescent Society in November 2023. Back then, you, Dr. Al-Khatib, you asked us to listen to the cries of children soaked in blood, asking why this is happening, what they have done, and why the world is so indifferent to their lives. This feeling of abandonment by the international community, unfortunately, continues to this day. I can assure you that Slovenia is not indifferent, yet almost a year and a half later, we are unable to answer their question. So, colleagues, erosion of this magnitude can lead to one thing only, and this is a chaos. Despite challenges we face as the Council throughout this war, much has been done with clear, united demands from this Council, including through 4 resolutions. Let us make sure that our demands are implemented to prevent further erosion of the international system that we have built. Thank you.
Je remercie Monsieur le
I
rapporteur permanent
thank
de la
the permanent
Slovénie et je donne
representative
la
of
parole à
Slovenia.
Madame
I
la
now give the
rapporteure
floor
permanente
to
du
the
Royaume-Uni.
permanent representative of the United
President.
Kingdom.
I'd like to start by thanking High Commissioner Volker Turk and Dr. Yunus Al-Khatib for your sobering briefings. Our thoughts and deepest condolences are with the families of the Red Crescent medics and other humanitarians who were killed while bravely working to save lives in Gaza. Their deaths are an outrage, and we expect this incident to be investigated fully, transparently, and for those responsible to be held to account. Gaza remains the most dangerous place for humanitarians in the world. If Israel does not respect deconfliction notifications from aid workers to allow them to operate without coming under attack, there will be more appalling deaths like these ones. Aid workers should not have to risk their lives to help those in need. So we urge Israel to cooperate with the UN fact-finding mission into the hit on a UN compound on the 19th of March, to conduct thorough investigations into all incidents involving aid workers and medical personnel, and ensure accountability for those responsible. President, I have 3 points to make. First, the UK reiterates its call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, including Avinatan Orr, Yossi Sharabi and Shay Levinson, who have links to the UK. And we are clear, Hamas must be held accountable for their despicable actions. But the UK strongly opposes Israel's decision to resume and expand its military operations in Gaza. Since operations restarted, over 1,000 Palestinians have lost their lives, including at least 322 children. And civilians are being compressed into ever smaller areas. Further fighting and bloodshed is in nobody's interest and takes us further away from a deal to get the hostages home. Second, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is horrific, and there is reportedly less than a week of food left for distribution in Gaza. We urge Israel to reinstate the flow of humanitarian aid immediately. Blocking supplies and electricity from entering Gaza risks violating international humanitarian law. The UK is deeply concerned that the UN and humanitarian organisations have been forced to reduce operations in Gaza because it is so unsafe. Without their life-saving work, even more Palestinians will suffer. Third, the UK condemns remarks by Defence Minister Katz on the annexation of land in Gaza. There must be no forced displacement of Palestinians or reduction in the territory of Gaza. This would only further drive instability and undermine security for Israelis and Palestinians alike. And we condemn recent Israeli decisions to accelerate the establishment of settlements and outposts in the West Bank. President, in conclusion, the lesson we have learnt time and again in this Council is that diplomacy, not violence, is the only way to bring lasting peace. We urge the parties to return to a ceasefire, to end appalling loss of life, bring the hostages home, and make credible efforts towards a two-state solution. I thank you.
Je remercie Madame la représentante permanente du Royaume-Uni pour cette déclaration. Je donne la parole à Monsieur le représentant permanent de la Chine.
谢谢主席。我感谢阿尔及利亚倡议召开今天的会议，感谢图尔克人权高专和哈提卜先生所做的通报。穆斯林斋月刚刚结束，在这段对广大穆斯林信众十分神圣的日子里，加沙却再一次被死亡和杀戮笼罩。以色列3月17日重新开始实施大规模袭击，迄今已经造成1000多人死亡，其中包括300多名儿童。人道局势急剧恶化，200万民众被剥夺生存、物资供应，大量民众又一次面临流离失所。仅在过去2天，以色列的军事行动就已经导致10万多民众逃离拉法，加沙正在重新陷入战火。在更大的平民伤亡和人道灾难出现之前踩下刹车，是国际社会，特别是联合国安理会的当务之急。我讲3点：第一，必须以最大的紧迫感推动加沙持久停火，重开战事只会制造更多的杀戮和仇恨，绝不是解救人质的正确方式。实现持久停火才是拯救生命、让人质回家的最好办法。近日，以色列宣布将扩大地面进攻，占领加沙领土。我们对此表示严重关切，敦促以色列立即停止对加沙的军事行动。停火协议的保障国应当秉持公正、负责任态度，推动3阶段停火协议连贯落实，实现加沙持久停火。第二，必须采取切实行动，恢复加沙人道物资准入。以色列自3月2日切断加沙物资准入，已经整整1个月没有任何物资进入加沙。加沙200多万饱受折磨的民众再次面临严峻的人道危机。中方坚决反对把人道救援作为武器和谈判筹码的行为，解除对加沙的封锁，全面恢复人道物资准入，是以色列作为占领方必须履行的国际人道法义务。第三，必须制止任何针对人道工作者的袭击。联合国人员 UN personnel and humanitarian workers must not be targeted. Yet, this fundamental principle of international humanitarian law has been repeatedly violated in Gaza. Since the eruption of the current conflict, 408 aid workers have been killed in Gaza, making it the most dangerous place for humanitarians. On March the 23rd, 15 humanitarian workers were killed by the Israeli military, and their bodies were not found until March the 30th in a mass grave in Gaza. Also found near the grave were damaged vehicles with clear humanitarian markings. This is indeed shocking. We express our deepest condolences to the victims. We strongly condemn all attacks on UN personnel and humanitarian workers. We call for a thorough investigation into this incident to ensure accountability. While the conflict is raging in Gaza, the situation in the West Bank is extremely tense. Israel continues to escalate its military operations in the West Bank, forcibly expelling refugees from multiple camps, causing heavy civilian casualties and displacing over 40,000 people. Israel continues to expand settlements, condone settler violence, and squeeze the living space of the Palestinian people, eroding the basis of the two-state solution. Settlement activities are in breach of international law and Security Council resolutions and should cease immediately. President, implementing the two-state solution is the only viable way to resolve the question of Palestine. Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, are all integral parts of the state of Palestine. China opposes any forced relocation of Gazans and any attempts to annex the territories of Gaza or the West Bank. We support the Gaza Recovery and Reconstruction Plan initiated by Egypt and other Arab countries, and support the principle of Palestinians governing Palestine in the reconstruction process. The international community should redouble its efforts to advance the political process of the two-state solution and provide the necessary guarantees. China will continue to work tirelessly with the international community to end the conflict in Gaza, alleviate the humanitarian plight, implement the two-state solution, and ultimately achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the question of Palestine. Thank you, President.
I thank the
permanent representative of China for that statement. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank France for convening this emergency briefing at the request of Algeria, supported by Pakistan, China, the Russian Federation, and Somalia. We also thank Mr. Volker Turk, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Dr. Yunus Al-Khatib, President of the Palestine Red Crescent Society, for their sobering and very moving briefings. And I think they provide just a little glimpse of the dire situation faced by the Palestinians and all civilians on ground in the region. The Security Council has convened repeatedly to address the humanitarian catastrophe in the occupied Palestinian territories, particularly in Gaza. Yet, despite these discussions, the Council has failed to provide relief to the innocent Palestinians suffering from indiscriminate bombings, starvation, displacement, collective punishment, all of which are blatant violations of international law and international humanitarian law. This grave humanitarian crisis reflects the Council's inaction, setting a dangerous precedent. The Palestinian people are left questioning whether this body will take meaningful steps or merely lament their suffering. Our failure not only undermines this institution, but also erodes the international order built on the UN Charter. The Council must assert its relevance by ensuring the implementation of its own decisions before it is rendered inconsequential. Gaza has descended into an abyss of suffering, an unprecedented man-made catastrophe where hospitals, schools, and shelters are attacked indiscriminately. Children and women perish under the rubble. Humanitarian workers, including the UN personnel, are targeted deliberately to cut off the lifeline of the affected populations. And journalists are targeted and silenced to prevent reporting of the atrocities being committed by the Israeli occupation forces. Nothing is spared, not even the historic cultural sites. It is total annihilation, a situation where fundamental principles of humanitarian law are being disregarded with impunity. Israel's blatant violation of the ceasefire agreement brokered by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States has unleashed a reckless wave of killings and devastation. Instead of heeding calls from this Council, the General Assembly, and the ICJ, Israel has expanded its bombardments and ground operations. Since breaking the ceasefire last month, over 1,100 Palestinians have been killed, adding to the more than 50,000 martyred between October 23 and January 25, including 17,000 children. This is not just warfare, it is the systematic destruction of a people. For 1 month, Israel has sealed all border crossings, blocking humanitarian aid. No food or medical supplies have entered Gaza. UNICEF warns that 1 million children are without basic necessities, while WFP warns of imminent famine. Starvation as a weapon of war is a war crime. The deliberate targeting of aid convoys and medical personnel further dismantles international humanitarian law. More than 400 humanitarian workers, including 284 UNRWA personnel, have been killed, the highest toll in modern history. Pakistan strongly condemns the attack on a medical and emergency convoy on 23rd March, which killed 15 humanitarian workers in Gaza. When UN staff and humanitarian workers are gunned down with impunity, we must ask, what remains of the global order we built from the ashes of the World War II? While Gaza burns, the West Bank witnesses its own Nakba. Over 40,000 Palestinians have been driven from their homes, the largest displacement since 1967. 99 lives have been lost since January amid intensifying military raids and settler violence. Israel's intent to permanently colonize and annex the occupied West Bank is alarming and unacceptable. Equally concerning are Israel's plans to seize territory in Gaza, including the establishment of a so-called security corridor. This would constitute a dangerous escalation and a violation of international law. We also condemn the Israeli deliberate violation of Al-Aqsa Mosque's sanctity, an act of provocation and a clear breach of religious freedoms protections under international law. Mr. President, the international community, particularly this Council, must move beyond rhetorical condemnations to concrete action. Pakistan reiterates its calls for, first, an immediate cessation of hostilities, full implementation of the January ceasefire agreement by the parties in all its 3 stages, and that would be in accordance with this Council's Resolution 2735, and an extension of the ceasefire to the West Bank. Second, the immediate lifting of the illegal Israeli blockade to allow full, unconditional, and unimpeded humanitarian access. Starvation must not be allowed to be weaponized. Third, guarantees for the protection of UN staff and aid workers in line with international humanitarian law. In this regard, we would like to reiterate our proposal and call for setting up a global implementation dashboard for Resolution 2730 under the UN auspices. This dashboard would provide real-time public tracking of recording violations, investigations, and their outcomes. There must be accountability for these crimes. There must be an end to impunity. Fourth, prevention of any form of forced displacement of Palestinians from their land or annexation of Palestinian territory. Fifth, we all agree that the two-state solution remains the only viable path to sustainable peace. There is a clear need to revive a credible and irreversible political process towards that end. The June conference, to be co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia, will be an important milestone in this regard. Pakistan reaffirms its unwavering support for an independent, sovereign, and contiguous Palestinian state based on the pre-1967 borders, with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. Mr. President, Israel's violations and disregard for international law and the resolutions of this Council also extend beyond Gaza and Palestine to Lebanon and Syria, where we see repeated strikes in violation of the ceasefire, in violation of the Council's resolutions and international law. This is a familiar pattern that we have seen so often over a period of time, challenging this Council and the international community. I think this brings us back to the fundamental fact, a fact that a just and lasting peace in this region is possible only by addressing the root cause, and that is the Israeli occupation of the Arab territories, and this occupation must end. Mr. President, what is happening before our eyes is a travesty. It is simply unacceptable. The Council must act. We cannot be part of a body that remains a mere spectator and does nothing. We refuse to be part of this moral bankruptcy and what our Slovenian colleague referred to as erosion of humanity. We are at a crossroads. We clearly see from one side the occupying power, deliberate attempts to sabotage the hard-won ceasefire, to undermine the Gaza reconstruction plan endorsed by the Arab and the OIC summit, and welcomed by the international community, and an attempt to sabotage the efforts to revive the peace process for the realization of a two-state solution. Yet, the rest of the international community is clearly on the other side. It is clearly in support of peace, in support of ceasefire, in support of humanitarian assistance, and stands fully behind. I think the international community, represented by all regions around the world, they stand fully behind the imperative of a peace process and the June conference. We believe that in doing so, the wider international community stands for international law, justice, and peace. I think as members of this Council, it is our collective responsibility to translate the will of the international community into concrete actions, to finally move towards a just and durable peace in the region, and that is in the interest of all sides. Thank you very much.
I
thank the permanent representative of Pakistan for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank High Commissioner Turk and Dr. Al-Khatib for the alarming briefings. And let me convey my sincere condolences to all PRCS staff for those colleagues who were tragically killed as they dispatched to aid wounded civilians in Rafah. We support an independent investigation of the circumstances of the killings and expect those responsible to be held accountable. Mr. President, since hostilities resumed on 18 March, Council members have repeatedly sounded the alarm about the high numbers of civilian casualties in Gaza. According to UNICEF, as many as 100 children were killed or maimed every day of last week. Within less than a week, this is the third time the Council debates the protection of humanitarian personnel. While we underline that the protection of humanitarians is not up for debate, the importance of the Security Council addressing this issue cannot be understated. Since October 2023, at least 408 aid workers have been killed in Gaza, at least 280 of them UN staff members. The severity of the situation warrants our utmost attention. International humanitarian law also ensures special protection for healthcare workers and protects journalists as civilians from deliberate and direct attack. Yet, in Gaza, we have seen the highest number of journalists killed in 1 year compared to any other conflict recorded, and we receive daily alarming reports about attacks on ambulances, hospitals, as well as health workers. As many as 100 reportedly remain in Israeli detention. We condemn any attack on humanitarian workers, medical personnel, and journalists. They must be protected in accordance with the parties' obligation under international law, including when detained. The safety and well-being of the remaining hostages, illegally held since Hamas's brutal and indiscriminate terror attack on 7 October 2023, remain of grave concern to us. We call for their immediate and unconditional release and for Hamas to allow humanitarian access to them. The humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence are not empty words. They are key principles to be supported and respected at all times. Denmark reiterates that all parties to the conflict are bound by international law, including international humanitarian law. As part of this, the inviolability and neutrality of UN premises must be protected, including by refraining from their use for military purposes. Mr. President, in addition to those killed by hostilities in Gaza, we are receiving alarming reports of wounded and sick dying from conditions that would have been treatable if it wasn't for the complete humanitarian blockade cutting off 2 million people from basic assistance. Water, electricity, and medical supplies are lacking, and we are deeply concerned by reports from WFP that the last food parcels are now being distributed. We call on the government of Israel to abide by its obligation under international law to ensure full, rapid, safe, and unhindered provision of humanitarian assistance to the population in Gaza. Humanitarian assistance must never be used as a political tool. Let me also reiterate that Hamas can play no role in the future of Gaza. We have recently witnessed the brutal crackdown on freedom of expression and assembly by Hamas. This is, of course, completely unacceptable. Mr. President, in the West Bank, 40,000 Palestinians remain displaced as a result of Israel's military operations. We continue to see the rapid expansion of Israeli settlement, as well as an alarming escalation in settler violence. We once again remind Israel of its obligation to protect Palestinians against settler violence and to hold the perpetrators accountable, putting an end to the environment of near impunity. And we call on Israel to immediately halt all settlement expansions, which is a clear violation of international law. In this regard, we strongly oppose a recent decision by Israel's Security Cabinet to approve the separation and independence of 13 new settlements, as well as its decision to allocate funds for the construction of a separate road for Palestinians that will close off a vast area in the heart of the West Bank to Palestinian residents. Mr. President, in closing, we need a return to the full implementation of the ceasefire agreement. This includes the release of all the remaining hostages held by Hamas, a permanent end to hostilities, and unhindered humanitarian access. In parallel, we must not lose focus of the worrying situation in the West Bank. Israeli settlements are illegal under international law and undermine our common goal of a two-state solution, and thus the prospects of sustainable peace. Thank you.
Merci, Madame la
I thank the representative of Denmark for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I express appreciation to the delegation of Algeria for requesting this meeting. I also thank Mr. Volker Turk, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Dr. Younis Al-Khatib, President of the Palestine Red Crescent Society, for their sobering briefings. At the outset, Guyana offers its sincere condolences to the UN and PRCS on the loss of staffers in Gaza, and to the families of all those who recently died under very tragic circumstances. Mr. President, the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory is deteriorating rapidly, creating a severe security and humanitarian crisis. This crisis has been spawned by the ongoing violation of international law, including international humanitarian law. There is the risk of total collapse of international law in the region if the Council does not find the collective will to uphold the rule of international law. There must be a consistent application of international law, and member states of the United Nations have a special responsibility to uphold the rule of law. Guyana, therefore, calls on the Security Council to address the anomaly in Palestine, where the occupying power is inflicting immense hardships on Palestinians, including children, with no accountability. Mr. President, the incidents in Gaza over the past days are devastating signs of the depths to which the situation in Gaza has sunk. The reported deaths of UN and Palestine Red Crescent Society workers and other first responders, and the burial of their bodies in shallow graves near to clearly marked destroyed ambulances and a UN vehicle, must elicit our collective outrage and a demand for justice and accountability. Medical personnel and humanitarian workers must be safe to undertake their functions. Functioning, coordination, and deconfliction mechanisms are critical to ensuring this, and parties to a conflict are obligated to not cause harm. Guyana supports High Commissioner Turk's call for an independent, prompt, and thorough investigation into the incident of 23rd March, and for those responsible to be held to account. Mr. President, we have heard the vivid descriptions of the conditions to which Palestinians are subject, both in Gaza and the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Forced displacement on multiple occasions, deaths, starvation, and disease. While it is a repeat of the horrendous situation we saw since 7th October, some humanitarians have reported a level of recklessness and non-restraint not hitherto seen. Yesterday marked 1 month since supplies were barred from entering Gaza, leaving 2.1 million people to perish. 64% of Gaza is under active forced displacement orders, with about 200,000 people displaced again since the ceasefire broke down. The Council must respond to these atrocities in accordance with its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. In the occupied West Bank, the combination of settler violence and the ongoing Israeli military operations has also created a crisis for thousands of Palestinian civilians who have been injured, rendered homeless following the destruction or damage of their homes, or have suffered economic loss on account of the theft of their livestock or destruction of their farmlands. Mr. President, allow me to reiterate the following appeals. First, there must be an immediate cessation of all hostilities in Gaza and a return to the implementation of the ceasefire deal pursuant to Resolution 2735. Guyana also calls for the end of Israel's military operations in the occupied West Bank. Civilians are bearing the brunt of the violence, and their situation is becoming increasingly intolerable as they endure hardship after hardship. Second, the cessation of hostilities in Gaza must be followed by a permanent and unconditional ceasefire to create conditions for the recovery and reconstruction of Gaza. Third, all hostages still held in Gaza must be immediately and unconditionally released. The taking of hostages is a war crime, and those responsible must be held accountable. Fourth, Palestinians detained in Israeli jails without charge must be immediately and unconditionally released. We were saddened to learn of the death of Walid Ahmad, a 17-year-old Palestinian boy who had been detained in Israel since September 2024. According to reports, Walid was the first Palestinian child known to have died in an Israeli prison. There must be accountability for his death and for the remaining Palestinians in Israeli custody without the administration of justice. They deserve accountability. Fifth, as the occupying power, Israel is obligated to ensure that humanitarian needs are met in Palestine. We therefore call on Israel to ensure that humanitarian workers can operate freely and safely, that humanitarian supplies are allowed to enter Gaza, and that those supplies reach all civilians in need. We remind of the relevant provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice in January, March, and May 2024. Finally, Guyana calls for accountability for all of the crimes perpetrated against Palestinians and Israelis in the context of the October 7th war. We also call for justice and accountability for all Palestinian people who have been disenfranchised for almost 8 decades. A key element of justice is for Palestinians to exercise their right to self-determination, specifically to have a free and independent state of their own in accordance with the pre-1967 borders. This requires a political solution, and Guyana urges this Council and all UN member states to act in support of this just objective. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I would like to thank very much Mr. Volker Turk, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Mr. Yunus Al-Khatib, President of the Palestine Red Crescent Society, for their valuable briefings, which have clearly highlighted the magnitude of the human suffering and grave violations suffered by the Palestinian people. The convening of this emergency meeting reflects the deterioration of the humanitarian situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Mr. President, we have followed with deep concern and condemnation the recent reported targeting by the Israeli Air Force of an UNRWA health center in Jabalia, which was used as a shelter for over 700 displaced Palestinians. This bombardment led to the killing of 22 people, including 9 children, one of whom was just 2 weeks old. These figures, while preliminary, represent yet another tragedy in the chain of tragedies to which Palestinian civilians are subjected on a daily basis, including the discovery of 15 emergency workers in a mass grave and 8 paramedics of the Palestinian Red Crescent Society with their protective gear. Here we express our condolences to Mr. Al-Khatib, to the families of the flagrant attack, the targeting, التي يفترض
of
أن
the
تكون
centers
ملاذا
of
آمنا
relief that should be a
للمدنيين
safe haven
يعد
for
انتهاكا
civilians
صارخا
is a
للقانون
flagrant
الدولي
violation of
الإنساني
international humanitarian law
ولمبادئ حماية
and the
المدنيين
principles
أثناء
of the
النزاعات.
protection of civilians in conflict.
لقد تضرر أكثر من 300
More
مرفق
than
تابع
300 UNRWA facilities have been damaged since the start of the
وهو
war,
أمر ندينه
which
بشدة
is totally
ويجب أن
unacceptable
يتوقف فورا وبدون أي
and
شروط.
must stop immediately without conditions, and we strongly condemn it.
السيد الرئيس
Mr. President,
في الضفة الغربية تتواصل
in the
العمليات
West Bank,
العسكرية المسماة
military
الجدار
operation
الحديدي
Iron Wall
والتي بدأت
continues,
في
which
مخيم
began
جنين
in the Jenin
وامتدت إلى
camp and
طولكرم
extended to
وطوباس.
Tulkram and Tubas.
إن استخدام الممنهج
The
المكثف
extensive
للقوة
use
بما
of
في
force,
ذلك
including
الغارات الجوية
airstrikes
ونزول الدبابات العسكرية
and the
والاستهدافات
incursion of
الممنهجة
military tanks
أدى إلى
and
دمار
systematic
واسع
targeting has
في
led to
البنية
extensive
التحتية
destruction
المدنية
of civilian
وأدت إلى تهجير
infrastructure and
أكثر
the
من
displacement of more
42,000
than
فلسطيني
42,000
فضلا
Palestinians,
عن
as
مقتل
well as the killing
65 شخصا بينهم
of
8 أطفال.
65 people, including
نشعر
8
ببالغ
children.
الألم
We are
حيال
deeply distressed
التجويع
by the
والتهجير الممنهج الفلسطيني
systematic displacement and starvation of
نشعر ببالغ الألم
Palestinians. We are
حيال
deeply
الأثر الجماعي
distressed
لهذه
by the
العمليات
collective impact
التي
of these
ترقى إلى
operations,
مستوى العقاب
which amount to
الجماعي
collective punishment,
خاصة التجويع
especially
والتهجير الممنهج الفلسطيني
starvation and
وإغلاق
systematic
10
displacement of
مدارس تابعة
Palestinians, and the
للأونروا
closure of 10
وتعطيل
UNRWA
الخدمات
schools and the
الأساسية
disruption of
والصحية
basic health,
والتعليمية
education and
والاجتماعية.
social services.
تؤمن الصومال إيمانا راسخا بأن
Somalia
احترام
firmly
القانون
believes that
الدولي
respect for
وخاصة القانون
international
الدولي
law,
الإنساني
in particular international
والقانون الدولي
humanitarian law
لحقوق
and
الإنسان
international human rights
هو
law,
أساس لا غنى
is
عنه
the
لتحقيق الأمن
indispensable foundation
والسلم
for
الدوليين
international peace and
وأن
security.
استمرار الانفلات
Continued
من
impunity
العقاب على
for grave
الانتهاكات
violations
الجسيمة
against
بحق المدنيين
Palestinian
الفلسطينيين
civilians
يقوض من
undermines
مصداقية
the
النظام
credibility
الدولي
of the international
ويزيد
system
من
and
معاناة
increases
الأبرياء.
the suffering of innocent people.
لذلك نؤكد
We therefore
على ضرورة
stress
تفعيل
the
أدوات
need
المساءلة
to
الدولية
operationalize international
وتوفير الدعم
accountability
الكامل
instruments and to
للآليات
provide full
القضائية
support
ذات الصلة
to
بما
relevant
في
judicial
ذلك المحكمة
mechanisms,
الجنائية
including the
الدولية
International Criminal
ولتحقيق
Court,
الانتهاكات
and to
المرتكبة
investigate
وتقديم
violations and
المسؤولين
bring
عنها إلى
those
العدالة.
responsible to
لا
justice.
يمكن أن يكون هناك سلام عادل
There can be no
ودائم
just and
دون
lasting peace
مساءلة
without
حقيقية.
real accountability.
إن جمهورية الصومال الفدرالية تقف صفا واحدا مع
The Federal
العالم
Republic of
في
Somalia
دعم
stands
الحقوق
shoulder to
المشروعة
shoulder
للشعب
with its
الفلسطيني وترى أن
brothers
الصمت
in
المستمر
support of the legitimate
من
rights of
المجتمع
the
الدولي
Palestinian
على
people.
ما يجري
The international
في الأراضي
community's silence
الفلسطينية
on what is
المحتلة
happening in the occupied
يشكل
Palestinian
وصمة عار
territory
في جميع
is a
الإنسانية
disgrace to
وتهديد
humanity and a
للاستقرار
threat
الإقليمي
to regional and
والدولي.
international stability.
ومن هذا المنبر
From this
نؤكد
rostrum,
على أن
we
البيانات
stress
وحدها لا
that
تكفي.
data alone
ما
is
هو
not enough.
المطلوب اليوم هو
What is
اتخاذ
needed today
خطوات
are
عملية
practical
وفعالة
and effective
تفضي إلى
steps
وقف
leading to
فوري
an
لإطلاق
immediate
النار
ceasefire,
وضمان حماية
ensuring the
المدنيين
protection of
وفتح
civilians,
تحقيقات
launching
مستقلة
independent
وشفافة
and transparent
والسير نحو
investigations,
حل
and
سياسي
moving toward
شامل
a
يحقق
comprehensive
تطلعات
political
الشعب
solution that
الفلسطيني
fulfills the aspirations
بالحرية
of the Palestinian
والكرامة
people to freedom,
والسلام.
dignity, and peace.
سيد الرئيس
Mr. President,
نجدد تأكيدنا على
we
دعم حقوق الشعب
reaffirm our
الفلسطيني
support for the
الكاملة
rights of the
بما
brotherly
في ذلك حقه في
Palestinian
التقرير
people in
المصيري
full, including the right to
وإقامة دولته
self-determination
المستقلة
and the establishment of an
وعاصمتها
independent state with
كما
Al-Quds
نطالب
al-Sharif
بوقف
as its
فوري
capital. We also call for the
للاستعمار
immediate
الأراضي
cessation
الفلسطينية المحتلة
of the
ولجميع الأعمال
occupation
العسكرية
of
التي تستهدف
occupied
المدنيين
Palestinian territory and all
ونؤكد على ضرورة توفير الحماية
acts that
الدولية
target
العاجلة
civilians and
للشعب
stress the need for
الفلسطيني
urgent international
وضمان
protection for
وصول
the Palestinian
المساعدات
people and for the
الإنسانية
unimpeded
دون
humanitarian
أي عواقب.
access.
وندعو المجلس الأمن
We call on
إلى
the Security
الإطلاع
Council to
بمسؤوليته
assume its
القانونية
legal and
والأخلاقية
moral
في حفظ
responsibility
السلم والأمن الدوليين
towards the maintenance of
واتخاذ
international
خطوات
peace and
ملموسة
security and to take
لوضع
concrete
حد
steps to put an end
للانتهاكات
to the
المستمرة
ongoing
التي
violations
تقوض القانون الدولي
that undermine
وتعيق أي
international
فرصة
law
للسلام العادل
and any chance
والدائم
of just and
في
lasting
المنطقة.
peace in the region.
شكرا
I
سيد
thank
الرئيس.
you.
Je remercie Monsieur le représentant de la
I
Somalie.
thank the
Je donne la
representative
parole
of
à Monsieur
Somalia
le
and I give the
représentant de
floor
la
to
Grèce.
the permanent representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also wish to thank UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, Mr. Turk, and the President of the Palestine Red Cross Society, Dr. Al-Khatib, for the detailed briefings. Colleagues, it has only been a week since we mourned the loss of UNOPS and UNRWA personnel who have been providing lifeline support in a region where thousands of lives are put at risk. Yet the safety and security of humanitarian workers continue to be undermined on a daily basis. We are informed of the tragic loss of 15 Palestinian Red Crescent Society and UN staff members who died during an Israeli ground operation in Rafah on 23rd of March. In this regard, I wish to reiterate our condolences. Our thoughts and prayers are with the families. Mr. President, the protection of humanitarian and aid workers must remain a non-negotiable, absolute principle at all times, as proclaimed by international law and more specifically the Geneva Conventions. The same principles apply to civilians. Since the resumption of hostilities in the Gaza Strip, hundreds of Palestinians have been killed, thousands have been forced to flee due to continued airstrikes and new evacuation orders, and all of them are in urgent need of food, medical treatment, and shelter. Despite the reported dramatic surge in miscarriages by 300% during the war, children are still being born daily in Gaza under a total siege and deprivation of supplies for over a month. We regret the conditions that led the Secretary General to take the difficult decision to reduce the organization's footprint in Gaza, despite increased humanitarian needs and the growing concern over the protection of civilians. NGO workers report that the sense of fear and risk has significantly increased since the end of the ceasefire in Gaza. Mr. President, Greece has repeatedly condemned the October 7th terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas, as well as the ongoing detention and cruel and inhumane treatment of its hostages. We reiterate our demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, unequivocally condemning Hamas' terror. It is the people of Gaza that suffer in the face of Hamas' intransigence and Israel's relaunch of operation. In this context, we call on Israel to allow and facilitate the safe, unconditional, massive and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid at scale, to restore access to electricity and water, as well as to ensure the protection of civilians and other protected persons, including humanitarian workers, in line with international humanitarian law. Colleagues, the situation in the West Bank requires our urgent attention as well. While the focus of the international community is currently on Gaza, the security and humanitarian conditions in the West Bank are deteriorating. We are gravely concerned about the reports of increasing violence, displacement of more than 40,000 people from refugee camps in the north, attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, as well as demolition and seizure of Palestine-owned properties. Such actions constitute severe violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law, and they undermine the prospect of a peaceful resolution on the Palestine issue based on the two-state solution. Greece also deplores the increase of settlement activity in the West Bank. Such attempts are contrary to international law and the relevant Security Council resolutions and have no legal validity. At the same time, UNRWA's role remains pivotal and indispensable. We are particularly troubled by the continuous attacks on UN premises, including yesterday's attacks on the UNRWA Health Center in Jabalia, which led to severe casualties, including 9 children. International law clearly proclaims the inviolability of UN premises, in the absence of which UN colleagues face severe risks as they work to save civilian lives and promote peace globally. Mr. President, the resumption of hostilities and the death toll is cause of grave concern. We call on all parties to seize the opportunity to return to the negotiations table with the aim of achieving a permanent ceasefire and the immediate release of all hostages. We commend the mediators, Egypt and Qatar and the United States, for not giving up on the efforts. Our discussion is always framed by the prospect of a two-state solution, aligned with the acquis of the Security Council resolutions, and recognizing the right of Israel to live in peace and security. The upcoming June conference, under the co-presidency of France and Saudi Arabia, could be a critical milestone in this regard. In addition, the Arab Recovery and Reconstruction Plan for Gaza, as presented by Egypt, is a constructive proposal, as is the upcoming International Reconstruction Conference to be held in Cairo next month. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Greece for that statement. I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you to Commissioner Turk and President Al-Khatib for your briefings. Hamas is solely responsible for the resumption of hostilities since March 18th, refusing time and again to accept proposals to extend the ceasefire. For too long, Hamas has abused civilian infrastructure and facilities, cynically using it to physically shield its personnel and weaponry. Hamas's reckless and contemptuous behavior has put civilians and humanitarian personnel at risk, purposefully placing them in the crossfire. The use of civilians and civilian objects to shield or impede military operations is a violation of international humanitarian law, which all parties to armed conflict must comply with. Mr. President, I join others in expressing sincere condolences for the humanitarian workers who lost their lives in this conflict. Every death, including those of UN and humanitarian workers that many have discussed today, would have been avoided had Hamas accepted the bridge proposal on the table last month. Moreover, the IDF has reported, with respect to the incident on March 23rd, that uncoordinated vehicles were identified advancing toward IDF troops without headlights or emergency signals. Additionally, the IDF has indicated that earlier that day, vehicles passed safely on the route after they were coordinated with the IDF. The IDF and COGAT established a deconfliction mechanism, and it is important that all actors use this mechanism to help ensure the safety of civilians and humanitarian workers. Mr. President, Hamas's reckless decisions have caused enough bloodshed. They have no right to represent Palestinians anywhere and must leave Gaza. All of this violence could stop today if Hamas returned the hostages and the bodies it still holds and laid down its weapons. There is one entity that could stop violence for everyone in a moment, and that is Hamas. The Council should speak with one voice to apply pressure on Hamas to, for the first time, act in the interests of the Palestinian people they purport to represent, and not in the interests of their own selfish ends. We must recognize the bravery of Palestinian civilians in Gaza protesting against Hamas's despotic rule, calling for Hamas to release the remaining hostages, step down, and leave Gaza forever. This flood of life movement reflects the civilian population's rejection of Hamas. This Council's efforts should focus on applying pressure to dislodge Hamas, who responded to these organic challenges to its rule the only way it knows how, by murdering 22-year-old Palestinian Odeh Nasser al-Arbai and disposing of his body at his family's home. We must heed Palestinian voices that reflect Hamas's failures and deadly rule over Palestinians in Gaza. And our partners in the region must amplify these voices too and remove Hamas from Gaza once and for all. As it relates to the West Bank, the United States supports the efforts of the Israel Defense Forces to root out violent extremists in Jenin and Tulkarem. We call on the Palestinian Authority to finally carry through on its announcement to end the practice of offering cash payments to the families of those who have carried out terrorist attacks, which for far too long incentivized violence against Israeli civilians and set back the prospects of peace. We will be closely monitoring implementation of these recent commitments. Colleagues, it has been nearly 18 months since Hamas started this horrific conflict, one that has upended so many lives and caused so much immense suffering. Hamas must release the remaining 59 hostages, including 5 Americans, New Jersey resident Idan Alexander, and the bodies of Itai Shen, Gad Haggai, Judy Weinstein-Haggai, and Omer Nutra, who were brutally murdered on October 7, 2023. President Trump has been clear that Hamas must release all remaining hostages immediately. As we have repeatedly said, the future of the Middle East must also look different. Fresh thinking is needed for a better tomorrow for Israelis, Palestinians, and all the region's people. We look forward to continued discussions with our Arab partners on the future of Gaza without Hamas. Thank you.
Je remercie Madame la représentante des États-Unis. Je donne la parole à Monsieur le représentant de la Fédération de Russie.
Representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Отмечаем выступление
We note the statement of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk.
Благодарим
We thank the President of the Palestine Red Crescent Society, Younis Al-Khatib, for his thorough briefing on the situation in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict zone. And we are also grateful to Mr. Al-Khatib for his additional briefings and meetings with delegations during his time in New York. This allowed us to get the latest information about the situation on the occupied Palestinian territory. Right away, we supported the request of Algeria for today's Council meeting, since the situation on the occupied Palestinian territory in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank remains unacceptably critical. After the breakdown in the agreement between Hamas and Israel, for more than a month now, Palestinian civilians have been in the conditions of a full ground, air and maritime blockade. West Jerusalem is not only blocking the delivery of humanitarian goods, but has also restricted the work of the humanitarian organizations of the UN, which led to existential problems for 2 million people. A simple example is that all of the bakeries in the enclave have closed due to a shortage of flour and fuel. How the lack of bread in Gaza is going to help Israel release the hostages who also aren't getting that flour is a mystery for us. Alongside the humanitarian catastrophe, we are seeing the ongoing destruction of civilian infrastructure and the deaths of humanitarian workers. Since October 2023, in Gaza, at least 408 staff of humanitarian organizations have died. That makes this conflict the most lethal by this measure since records began. Hope for the situation changing for the better is almost non-existent because Israel strikes on the Gaza Strip are carrying out on an almost constant basis. On the 2nd of April at 10 a.m., the Israeli Air Force launched a strike on the UNRWA Medical Center in Jabalia. Although that object was no longer being used for medical purposes, it was serving as a shelter for more than 700 people. According to reports, as a result of this latest inhumane Israeli attack, dozens of civilians died, including a child that was barely 2 weeks old. Despite the warnings of UNRWA staff members about the risks of staying in the building after the attack, many of the displaced families stayed there because they simply had nowhere else to go. Today alone, as a result of indiscriminate Israeli airstrikes across the Gaza Strip, at least 100 people have been killed. Bombs have been dropped on residential buildings, schools that were being used as shelters and tent cities. Witnesses report that in Gaza City, where 58 people died, local residents, in the absence of any rescue equipment, had to clear the rubble with their bare hands in the hope of, by some miracle, finding survivors. We express our sincere condolences to all of those that have been killed, and we wish a swift recovery to those affected. We underscore that it is also the so-called security zones that are being hit, those zones that were established by the Israelis themselves. Such blatant disregard for the norms of international humanitarian law deserves to be roundly condemned. In total, since the beginning of the war, more than 300 UN objects have been attacked, and some of them repeatedly so. Mr. President, we were shocked by the news of the discovery on the 31st of March of a mass grave in which 15 humanitarian workers were buried, including UN staff and 8 medics from the Palestine Red Crescent Society. Representatives of OCHA have already placed responsibility for this crime on Israel. According to UN data, after the first group of medics and humanitarian workers went missing on the 23rd of March, the Israelis methodically took out all of those that tried to come to the aid of their comrades. And yet, the ambulances were clearly marked, as were the doctors' uniforms. These sorts of actions can have no justification. In the context of the discussion of this specific subject, we call upon all parties to make every effort to find the one member of the Palestine Red Crescent team that is still listed as missing, Asad al-Nasasra. His body was not found among the dead. The protection of humanitarian personnel, which the Council discussed in detail in this chamber literally yesterday, is an unconditional imperative and obligation in accordance with the norms of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, having, following the end of the first phase of the agreement with Hamas, made further demands for the further implementation of the agreement, Israel resumed its military operation and is gradually expanding its control over Gaza. On the 1st of April, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced the creation of a second Philadelphia corridor, the Morag axis, that would cut Rafah off from Khan Yunis. We should also, in the same vein, consider the statement of the Minister of Defense of Israel, Israel Katz, about the expansion of military operations in the enclave and the creation of additional security zones. Thus, the territory upon which Gazans have to huddle is steadily shrinking, and this forces them to make a choice: to remain in Gaza without water, electricity, or sufficient sustenance, in the hope that the Israeli operation will at some point end and that they will not become the victims of another airstrike, or to leave the Gaza Strip. Of course, in these circumstances, there can be no discussion of evacuation or voluntary immigration. We confirm our position of principle that it is unacceptable for there to be territorial and demographic changes in Gaza, which was and remains an integral part of the Palestinian state. In the context of the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, particularly under the full blockade introduced since the 2nd of March, we are increasingly concerned by signals from various sources about Israel's plans in future to establish full control over the supply and distribution of assistance to the enclave. We hope that West Jerusalem will not take these steps, which would contradict the reports to the Security Council by the UN Senior Coordinator for the Provision of Humanitarian Assistance and Reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, Sigrid Kaag, about the functioning of the one-stop shop mechanism agreed with Israel, which we all supported. We also confirm our firm support for UNRWA, which plays an irreplaceable role in providing assistance to the Palestinians. The agency's experience, its extensive system of humanitarian assistance, and the infrastructure built up over decades is vital in the current critical situation in the enclave. We call upon the Israeli authorities to revise the discriminatory and prohibitive decisions relating to UNRWA and to return to compliance with its international legal obligations. Mr. President, a worrying situation is also forming on the West Bank. The Israeli Operation Iron Wall is expanding. In Jenin alone, 34 people have been killed and dozens were wounded. 21,000 people have become internally displaced persons, and at least 600 homes have been destroyed. Since the 7th of October 2023, on the West Bank, around 16,000 people have been detained. The provocations continue by settlers. 50 extremist settlers organized a pogrom in the Palestinian village of Duma. Unfortunately, the Israeli authorities are not only not punishing the offenders, but they are often indulging them. The Israeli settlement expansion on the West Bank is taking place with unprecedented speed. 47% of the West Bank has already essentially been taken away from Palestinians. In the first 3 months of this year, the construction of 10,503 housing units has been approved, which is higher than the similar figure for the whole of 2024. By some assessments, at this rate, in 2 years' time, any prospects for the two-state solution will be entirely wiped out. Even today, the West Bank is essentially divided into two parts because of Israel's infrastructure projects in Jerusalem, and hundreds of checkpoints across the West Bank are seriously restricting the daily activities of Palestinians. Such actions are entirely in line with Israel's practice over decades in the West Bank of taking steps that rule out the continued contiguity of the OPT. Key parts of this tactic are settlement blocks and related infrastructure, the dividing wall, the system of roadblocks and checkpoints, and the destruction of Palestinian buildings, the confiscation of land, and organizing regular security raids, which are now spilling over into fully fledged operations in Jenin, Tulkarm, and other cities. We are also deeply concerned by the broader regional context. The resumption of arbitrary Israeli strikes on Beirut and continuing airstrikes on Syria, US strikes on Yemen, and also the preparations for public opinion for a full-scale operation against Iran. In sum, today the entire Middle East region is closer to a large-scale conflict, the consequences of which would be catastrophic. We call upon all to step back from this dangerous brink. Mr. President, the logic of war fully rules out any possibility of returning home the Israeli hostages. In this paradigm, there's space for further senseless deaths and destructions, mass graves of doctors, thousands of children killed, but that same logic rules out prospects for the reconstruction of Gaza that was realistically outlined in the plan proposed by the Arab states. In the inhumane conditions that the residents of the enclave have to survive in and that are being created in the West Bank, a breeding ground is being created for radicalization and breeding hatred for Israel and its people. What is the point for West Jerusalem of getting rid of Hamas if its place is occupied by other people with another name for whom the struggle with Israel will be the only way for them to restore justice? In fact, decades without a just solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is precisely what led to the present tragic situation. We are convinced of the need for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, the release of all forcibly detained persons, and ensuring safe and unhindered humanitarian access. At the same time, it is important that the agreements reached are sustainable. As practice shows, without guarantees and oversight by the international community, any truces could collapse overnight. In that regard, the UN Security Council must play a key role in the negotiating process and in ensuring compliance with its outcomes by all parties. We call upon international mediators to make this a priority in their efforts to return to the peace process. In this context, we would like to once again confirm our unchanging commitment to the creation of an independent Palestinian state in the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. It must coexist in peace and security with Israel in accordance with the approved international legal decisions. Colleagues, in these circumstances, there could be dangerous consequences for the preserving of a vacuum in key posts in the region, the Special Coordinator for the peace process and the Senior Coordinator for assistance to the Palestinians. We call upon the UN Secretary General as quickly as possible to present the UN Security Council with candidates to that effect. In conclusion, we would like to underscore that, as regards possible practical steps by the Council and the adoption of products related to the worsening crisis in Gaza, we are guided by the position of the Arab group. We also stand ready to work with everyone that wants to achieve a just, long-term and sustainable peace in the Middle East on the basis of the well-known Security Council decisions in the context of the Palestinian-Israeli peace process. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank you for convening this meeting at the request of Algeria, with support from the Russian Federation, China, Pakistan, and Somalia on the concerning situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. I thank High Commissioner Volker Turk for his comprehensive and sobering briefing. I commend Dr. Younis Al-Khatib, President of the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, for the selfless humanitarian work in the most difficult and dangerous circumstances, and I thank him for the compelling contribution. Sierra Leone is gravely alarmed by the rapidly deteriorating situation in the OPT. The humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza and the surge in violence across the West Bank demand urgent and sustained attention by the Security Council. Every additional day of conflict means more lives lost, more families shattered. The killing must stop. We must uphold our collective responsibility to protect human life and dignity under international law. For weeks, Gaza has endured a total blockade, coupled with relentless bombardment. For over a month, no food, water, fuel, or electricity entered Gaza, creating a man-made crisis of epic proportions. Around 90% of Gaza's population is now displaced, many multiple times. The entire population depends on humanitarian assistance for survival. Despite soaring needs, life-saving relief has been obstructed. Hospitals have shut down for lack of fuel and security, while thousands of wounded civilians go untreated. Water, food, and medicine are critically scarce. The civilian population is exhausted, starving, and desperate. Humanitarian workers have not been spared. Since October 2023, at least 369 aid workers, including 263 UNRWA staff, have been killed. They are among the highest casualty figures ever recorded for humanitarian personnel in any conflict. Most were Palestinians, serving their own communities. We express our deepest condolences to the family of the aid workers killed. Sierra Leone strongly deplores these killings and all attacks on humanitarian personnel. These actions are not just violations of international law, they are violations of our shared humanity. The legal obligations are clear. Under the Fourth Geneva Convention and customary international law, the State of Israel, as the occupying power, is responsible for the safety and welfare of the civilian population in the OPT. This includes ensuring access to food, water, medicine, and other essentials. These are not aspirational principles. They are binding rules that save lives. We therefore draw the attention to the binding provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice in the application of the Genocide Convention, South Africa versus Israel case. The ICJ has ordered the State of Israel to ensure the provision of basic humanitarian necessities to Gaza. The provisional measures are binding under international law. To date, these measures have not been respected. The defiance and seeming impunity undermine the credibility of the international legal system and even this Council. Mr. President, even as Gaza is being plummeted by bombs, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is witnessing an alarming escalation. Since 7 October 2023, settler violence against Palestinians has more than doubled. Attacks include assault, arson, and destruction of homes and livelihood, and often reportedly carried out in the presence or with the acquiescence of Israeli security forces. We are deeply concerned by reports of entire Palestinian villages being emptied following settler threats, violence, and forced displacement. These acts are occurring in a climate of impunity, defying the State of Israel's obligation as the occupying power to protect civilians under international humanitarian law. We recall the advisory opinion of the ICJ regarding the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and the clear view of the World Court that, and I quote, "The State of Israel is under an obligation to bring to an end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible." End of quote. The government of the State of Israel is, however, acting to the contrary. Sierra Leone is therefore gravely alarmed by these grave breaches of international law, including excessive force, punitive military raids, and settler violence. These abuses are part of a broader crisis and must be addressed accordingly and immediately. Without accountability, tensions will continue to rise. Impunity entrenches, and prospects for peace will further diminish. Respect for international law is not optional. We reiterate that all parties must comply. That includes Palestinian armed groups, notably Hamas. We continue to strongly condemn the deliberate targeting of Israeli civilians, the killing of non-combatants, and the taking of hostages. These actions violate international law and must cease. All hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. The principle of humanity applies to all. There can be no double standards. Israeli and Palestinian lives are equally valuable. and no civilian anywhere should live in fear of violence, starvation, or displacement. Mr. President, the Security Council cannot remain a passive observer. We have heard the Secretary General's call for humanitarian ceasefire. We have seen the ICJ issue binding orders. We have witnessed immense courage for humanitarian workers facing fire to deliver aid. The Council must continue to act, even if within the framework of Resolution 2735. Sierra Leone therefore calls for the following urgent steps. First, an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. The Council must call for all hostilities to stop, and now. The continuation of military operations in densely populated areas only guarantees further death and destruction. There is no military solution. A political process must begin with silencing the guns. Second, the Council to demand for unimpeded humanitarian access and aid. Gaza must be fully and considered accessible to humanitarians and for humanitarian aid. Safe corridors must be established for the delivery of food, fuel, medicine, and the treatment or evacuation of the sick and wounded. All obstacles to aid, including blockades and administrative delays, must be removed immediately. In this regard, we call for the full implementation of all Security Council resolutions 2712, 2720, and 2728. Third, on the release of hostages and detainees. All hostages held by armed groups must be freed without delay. No cause justifies the captivity of civilians. At the same time, we cannot ignore the thousands of Palestinians, including children, held in detention, often without due process. Their rights must also be respected. We encourage all parties to re-engage in the mediation efforts leading to mutual releases. Beyond these steps, Sierra Leone urges renewed international commitment to a just and lasting peace based on international law and the relevant resolutions of the General Assembly and the Security Council. The current escalation has again demonstrated that the status quo of occupation, blockade, and repeated violence is untenable. We must redouble efforts towards a political solution that ends the occupation and secures the legitimate rights and security of both Palestinian and Israeli. The devastation in Gaza and the West Bank is a blight on the conscience of the world. This Council must not look away. The violence must end, the collective punishment must end, the suffering must end. Let us act not only in words, but through clear and principled actions. Let us demonstrate that the United Nations still stands for the protection of the vulnerable and the upholding of international law. Sierra Leone stands ready to support all efforts towards de-escalation, humanitarian relief, and a path to peace. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Sierra Leone. I give the floor to the permanent representative of Panama. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Panama is grateful to the representative of Algeria for his initiative to convene this briefing. We value the briefings delivered by Volker Turk, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and by Dr. Younis Al-Khatib, President of the Palestine Red Crescent Society. They have both provided details of the protracted humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the West Bank. This crisis continues to worsen with human consequences that are increasingly devastating in nature. 1 month after the total closure of crossings allowing access into Gaza, humanitarian agencies have warned that
reserves of food, medicines, fuel, and drinking water have already run out. The World Food Programme has confirmed the closure of the 25 bakeries that were continuing to operate with its support, this owing to a lack of supplies. Moreover, UNICEF has warned that around 130 children are born every day in extremely precarious conditions and conditions of extreme vulnerability, without food, without medical care, and with no access to functioning hospitals.
Instamos a que en un gesto que sería enaltecedor se permita el acceso urgente de la vital ayuda humanitaria.
Of morality
Desde la reanudación de las hostilidades el 18 de marzo,
since the resumption of hostilities on the 18th of March, more than 1,000 people died, of which 322 at least were children. Another 609 have been wounded.
En lo que lleva esta trágica guerra,
since the beginning of this tragic war, more than 1 million children have been repeatedly displaced, surviving in makeshift shelters among piles of rubbish and with no access to essential services. Only yesterday, an UNRWA clinic located in Jabalia in the north of the Strip that was functioning as a shelter for more than 700 people, displaced people, was attacked, caused the death of 15 people, including 9 children, among which was a newborn of only 2 weeks old. 2 women were also killed. According to UNRWA, many families are opposed to leaving the center, quite simply because they have nowhere to go. Panama deeply regrets the loss of innocent lives and urges the immediate cessation of hostilities and the protection of the civilian population, particularly of women, children, and humanitarian workers. Mr. President, in addition to the details outlined above, conditions have made the provision of humanitarian assistance not only impracticable, but also incredibly perilous for those working on the ground. It is a source of concern to receive news such as that from the 31st of March regarding the finding in Gaza of more than some 10 victims. They were found under the rubble and under the sand and were identified as members of the Palestine Red Crescent Society as well as of the Palestinian Civil Defense, and these people included one UN worker. All had been missing since the 23rd of March. Our condolences go to their loved ones. As we have stated on previous occasions, we reiterate the fact that gravely serious events such as these require comprehensive inquiries in order to clarify surrounding circumstances, dissipate doubt, and identify those responsible. This is because these events stand as deplorable examples of incidents which must not occur, and incidents which starkly underline the need to protect civilians and humanitarian personnel in context of armed conflict. Since the beginning of the conflict in Gaza, at least 408 humanitarian workers have lost their lives. These workers died while endeavoring to save lives. Panama fervently appeals to all parties at all times to guarantee the protection of humanitarian personnel and the inviolability of humanitarian premises. Mr. President, we call for the urgent restoration of the ceasefire in Gaza. The days during which the truce, however weak, was enforced demonstrated that humanitarian assistance can arrive and that it is possible to release hostages. We cannot forget those that are still being detained by Hamas in Gaza.
La situación de esos rehenes sigue siendo incierta. Una vez más, exigimos su liberación inmediata e incondicional, así como que se les garantice con urgencia protección, atención médica y contacto con sus familias. Señor Presidente, al igual que en Gaza, Panamá observa con preocupación el creciente deterioro de la situación en Cisjordania. Los informes recientes describen un entorno cada vez más coercitivo, marcado por desplazamientos forzados, demoliciones de viviendas, violencia recurrente y severas restricciones de movimiento que afectan la vida cotidiana de miles de personas. Reiteramos la importancia de que todas las acciones sobre el terreno se ajusten estrictamente a las normas del derecho internacional, incluido el derecho internacional humanitario y las resoluciones adoptadas por este Consejo, cuyo cumplimiento es esencial para preservar la dignidad humana y avanzar hacia una solución integral. Señor Presidente, el prolongado sufrimiento que se vive tanto en Gaza como en Cisjordania es abrumador y no puede desvincularse de las decisiones y acciones extremistas que han exacerbado el conflicto, como lo fue, sobre todo, el ataque del 7 de octubre y la toma de rehenes por parte de Hamas, actos inhumanos que Panamá siempre ha condenado. El trágico resultado de esa barbaridad es que hoy miles de familias palestinas se enfrentan condiciones críticas, mujeres obligadas a dar a luz en refugios improvisados y sin atención postnatal, niños que pierden la vida por causas que podrían haberse evitado, en medio de un sistema de salud colapsado y una grave escasez de servicios básicos para la población. Cada una de estas realidades demuestra que insistir en la vía militar y el extremismo solo perpetúa el sufrimiento. Solo una solución política profundamente humana y moralmente ineludible, libre del extremismo de Hamas, podrá sentar las bases para una paz duradera para israelíes y palestinos.
lay the foundations for a lasting peace for the Israelis and the Palestinians. On this journey, Panama will support all initiatives that contribute to making that reality possible. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for his statement. I give the floor to the permanent representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank High Commissioner Volker Turk and the President of the Palestine Red Crescent Society, Dr. Al-Khatib, for their detailed briefings. Mr. President, the Republic of Korea reiterates its deep concern over the situation in occupied Palestinian territory, where innocent Palestinian civilians are incessantly suffering under prolonged and intense hostilities and the lack of basic necessities. In Gaza, we are appalled by the repeated instances where civilians and humanitarian workers were hit by deadly Israeli strikes. Yesterday's announcement that Israel will seize more land in Gaza militarily further deepens our concern over the endless suffering of Palestinian civilians. The targeting of an UNRWA clinic building in northern Gaza just yesterday and the school of Gaza City today, which resulted in dozens of child casualties, as well as the discovery of a mass grave filled with the bodies of aid workers, including 8 PRCS members, are outrageous and tragic developments. We note Israel's announcement indicating that the IDF intended to target Hamas operatives. However, the clear fact is that the majority of those killed in such instances were innocent civilians, including children and humanitarian workers. Such an attack is simply unacceptable. Hamas is also violating international humanitarian law. The rockets fired by Hamas and other militants from civilian infrastructure targeting population centers in Israel are unjustifiable. Thus, we reiterate our demand that all the parties to the conflict, notably Israel, must adhere to the principles of international humanitarian law, including those of distinction, precaution, and proportionality. Thorough and credible investigations should follow for all alleged violations of international law, and perpetrators must be held accountable. We also stress that it is the occupying power's legal obligation to permit free passage of humanitarian relief. Thus, we once again call on Israel to allow entry of aid and commercial goods into Gaza. Hamas' refusal to an immediate and unconditional release of hostages is unconscionable, but this does not legitimize the blocking of humanitarian aid. Mr. President, as other colleagues here in this chamber have pointed out, the situation in the West Bank is also disturbing. The current military operations in northern West Bank by Israel are causing large-scale death, destruction, and displacement for civilians. Expansion of settlements in clear violation of international law and Security Council Resolution 2334, as well as rampant settler violence, are driving Palestinians off their land and must be stopped. Moreover, inflammatory statements and actions such as senior Israeli officials' visits to holy sites are further worsening instability in the West Bank and beyond. Mr. President, since the collapse of the ceasefire in Gaza last month, we are witnessing a repetition of the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, as well as risky escalation and further disruptions in the broader Middle East, including Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. As such, we call on both parties to listen to the desperate voices of innocent Palestinian civilians, the voices of Israeli hostages still held in Gaza, as well as those Palestinians protesting against the brutal rule of Hamas, including Uday, a young participant at the anti-Hamas protest who was then tortured to death. In closing, Mr. President, Israel has the right to protect itself in line with international humanitarian law. However, military means cannot secure sustainable peace and stability for Israelis and their neighbors. Considering the overarching importance of a resolution to the Palestinian question for sustainable peace in the region, we strongly believe that forging a long-term peaceful political environment in the Middle East is directly interconnected with the advancement of the two-state solution. We hope that, starting with a successful ceasefire hostage release deal, a sincere discussion for the reconstruction of Gaza and for coexistence between Israel and Palestine based on the two-state solution can follow in a meaningful way. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie Monsieur le représentant permanent de la Corée pour sa déclaration et je vais maintenant faire une déclaration en ma qualité de représentant de la France. La France remercie Monsieur le Haut-Commissaire des Nations Unies aux droits de l'homme, Monsieur Volker Türk et Monsieur le Président du Croissant-Rouge palestinien, le Dr. Younes Al-Khatib, pour leurs interventions qui nous ont éclairés. Notre Conseil s'est réuni à maintes reprises ces dernières semaines pour évoquer le sort des otages, la situation à Gaza, la colonisation en Cisjordanie et la protection du personnel humanitaire. L'extrême gravité de la situation exige, nos intervenants l'ont rappelé, mais la situation actuelle appelle surtout à l'action du Conseil, à la fois dans l'immédiat, pour faire taire les armes et reprendre les règlements humanitaires, mais aussi pour sur le long terme, il faut restaurer un horizon politique pour les Israéliens, comme pour les Palestiniens. Et pour ce faire, l'offensive israélienne doit cesser. Le président de la République l'a dit, il n'y aura pas de solution militaire à Gaza. La rupture du cessez-le-feu et la reprise des frappes israéliennes à Gaza constituent un retour en arrière dramatique. Il est urgent que les hostilités cessent. Et nous saluons les efforts de médiation déployés par les États-Unis, l'Égypte et le Qatar. Tous les otages doivent être libérés sans plus de délai et dans la dignité. Ils n'ont que trop souffert. Le Hamas doit mettre un terme au traitement inhumain, dégradant et humiliant qu'ils subissent. Nous sommes solidaires de leur calvaire, solidaires de leurs familles. Nous sommes solidaires du peuple israélien face aux attaques terroristes commises par le Hamas et d'autres groupes terroristes le 7 octobre 2023 que la France ne cessera de condamner. Dans l'immédiat également, le blocage de l'aide humanitaire doit prendre fin. Nous l'avons dit vendredi, hier, et nous le disons à nouveau aujourd'hui, la protection des travailleurs humanitaires qui ont déjà payé un lourd tribut à Gaza doit être garantie
must be guaranteed in all circumstances in accordance with international law. We condemn Israeli fire upon ambulances, a fire which killed 15 rescue workers in Gaza. The Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs, Jean-Noël Barrot, said the following: these attacks were unacceptable. Humanitarian workers must never be targeted. France conveys its condolences to the families of the 8 rescue workers of the Palestinian Red Crescent, the 6 rescue workers of the Palestinian Civil Defense, and to the families of the UNRWA staff member. Full clarity must be achieved around this attack, and the fate of those missing must be clarified. We must continue to build Gaza's tomorrow. Gaza's future must be Palestinian. We oppose any forcible displacement of people and any form of territorial seizure. Arab leaders have presented a credible plan for Gaza's reconstruction, with concrete proposals being made to guarantee security and establish a new Palestinian government from which Hamas must be excluded. France, alongside its European partners, supports this plan and contributes to discussions regarding its implementation. In the West Bank, prospects of the two-state solution continue to fade day by day. France reiterates its condemnation for the settlement policy. This is illegal, pursuant to international law, just as is the settler violence. France once again opposes all forms of annexation, and in Jerusalem, the status quo of holy sites must be respected. Finally, Palestinians and Israeli people have the right to live in peace and security. Achieving that goal involves providing credible security guarantees to Israel and ensuring the construction of a viable, contiguous Palestinian state. Only the two-state solution will lead to a just and lasting peace, and it is fueled by this conviction that France, together with Saudi Arabia in Europe, is preparing a conference in accordance with the General Assembly decision, a conference on the implementation of that solution. Now, we need to see the release of hostages, the resumption of the ceasefire, and an inquiry into attacks against humanitarian personnel. There also needs to be the immediate resumption of humanitarian aid, the cessation of settlement activity. That must urgently be this Council's message. Thank you.
Je reprends mes fonctions de président du
I
Conseil.
now resume my function as President of the Security Council.
Je donne maintenant la parole à Monsieur l'observateur permanent de l'État observateur de Palestine.
Permanent representative of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting upon the request of Algeria and with the support of China, Pakistan, Russia, and Somalia. I want to thank Mr. Turk, High Commissioner of Human Rights, for his presence among us and his briefing. Allow me also, Mr. President, at the outset to salute Dr. Yunus Al-Khatib, and through him, the heroes of the Palestine Red Crescent Society and the other humanitarians who are also the victims, rescuers needing to be rescued. While this council was convening to address protection of humanitarians and its resolution 2730 yesterday, we were mourning 15 humanitarians, including 8 members of the Palestine Red Crescent Society, killed and buried under the sand together with their ambulances. A UN vehicle and a fire truck, shot in their head and in their chest multiple times, with several of them with their hands and legs tied. They were executed for performing their sacred mission, killed for trying to save lives. And I sent to you, Mr. President, a few minutes ago, a tape that was sent to me that was found in the body of one of the martyrs who videotaped this attack against the convoy while all of the cars with their lights on and the sirens on when they were ambushed by the Israeli army. And I leave it up to your discretion to share it with our colleagues to see with their own eyes exactly what happened. I was also told that there is another longer tape. They are trying to make it available to all of you to see the evidence of this crime through the eyes of one of the victims. Mr. President, this is a multi-layered siege, blocking humanitarian aid completely, but also making sure the civilian population is denied any assistance by killing humanitarians, destroying hospitals, and bombing shelters. Yesterday, the world has watched again as Palestinian civilians, including children, were burned alive after the bombing of an UNRWA clinic where they had found refuge. And today, an Israeli strike on a school in Gaza City, sheltering displaced families, killed, as far as we know now the number, went rising to at least 31 killed, and wounded at over 100, the majority of them women and children. Massacre after massacre after massacre. Israel's objectives is clear. Maximum despair to convince the Palestinian population that the only alternative to death is displacement out of Gaza. Mr. President, this is what Israel claims is pressure, quote unquote, killing tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians and denying them humanitarian aid indispensable to their very survival. Minister of War Katz confessed to this policy of collective punishment, and I quote, expanding the operation will increase the pressure on the Hamas murderers and also on the population in Gaza, end of quotation. He is not hiding that the target of this so-called pressure is the entire civilian population. What he dupes pressure being applied on the Palestinian population in Gaza is mass starvation, mass killing, mass destruction, mass displacement. He goes on to tell on the residents of Gaza to act now to remove Hamas and return all the hostages, saying this is the only way to end the war. So the civilians being killed and maimed and displaced are the ones who bear the responsibility to end the war. Palestinians want life. They want the genocide to end. They want the horrors to stop. They want to be treated as human beings. They want to mourn their dead and to try to find a way back to life. They are shouting it out to anybody willing to hear. Israeli bombs make no distinction. For them, all Palestinians are guilty and all of them deserve to die. This morning I listened to a speech by my brother Yunus Al-Khatib in a meeting organized by the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. In that meeting he said many moving things, but one sentence captured my attention. He said that we, humanitarians, our job is to save lives. We do not make peace. It is your job. He was referring to delegates. And I thought that that is very telling. Him and his likes, they are in the business of saving lives, although they are losing their lives while they are doing that, but it is the business of all of you to make peace. He made that statement. So I hope that you allow me to repeat it on your behalf, because I thought it would be very appropriate also to be shared by the mighty Security Council. Mr. President, Israel's true objective is not the release of the hostages, but stealing Palestinian land. After having spread death and devastation across Gaza, Netanyahu has announced he is now dissecting Gaza, cutting through the territory and splitting it into pieces to annex it. Netanyahu spoke of seizing territory, openly and unapologetically. Israel's Minister of War confessed to that too, saying that Israeli occupation forces will, and I quote, capture extensive territory that will be added to the state of Israel's security areas. End of quotation. Israeli leaders in parallel continue taunting and taking every action to advance the so-called voluntary migration, the code name for forcible transfer of Palestinians. The widespread condemnation of these Israeli actions have yet to translate into effective pressure to force it to stop. It is mind-boggling that such outrageous confessions to such terrifying crimes that have been taking place for such a long time with such an impact on millions of Palestinian civilians can still go unanswered. Mr. President, in the West Bank, the same ideology is at play. 40,000 Palestinians displaced within weeks, destructions and devastation of civilian infrastructure, and an unprecedented push for emptying land of its Palestinian population in the pursuit of permanent annexation. The E1 plan, which has been denounced internationally for 25 years, is now moving forward at an accelerated pace. It would further sever East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank, cut the West Bank in two, and amounts to annexation of vast areas in the heart of the West Bank, thus dealing a fatal blow to peace efforts. We often speak of displacement of communities, but it is important that those sitting around this table fully grasp this reality. I wish that they could hear directly from Basil Adra from Masafer Yatta, who is sitting behind me back there. The man, the main protagonist and co-director of the Oscar-winning documentary No Other Land, who is present here, as I said, today, about all those Palestinians across the occupied Palestinian territory who just want to be able to live in their ancestral land and want what they face every day. How armed settlers, protected and enabled and accompanied by soldiers, attack Palestinian families and communities and terrorize them to push them to leave. How these communities build homes to see them destroyed, build them again to face another destruction, or to see them burned by settlers. How families end up living in caves to stay in their land. How they face the Israeli occupation army, the Israeli settlers, and the Israeli courts that coalesce to push them out. Mr. President, I began with Yunus and ended with Basil. I began with Gaza and ended with the West Bank. But I cannot forget Walid Ahmed, the 17-year-old boy who died in Israeli prisons last week. His autopsy showed severe muscle loss, colitis, and scabies, indicating he was subject, like many other Palestinian prisoners, to starvation, medical neglect, and ill treatment. Everywhere, Palestinians treated as subhumans, killed and maimed, and starved and tortured. When will the world's outrage lead to resolute action? When, I wonder. Mr. President, Palestinians are standing tall in the face of this occupation-made storm to uproot them or kill them where they stand. But they are tired, exhausted, mourning, and suffering. They are heroes, but not superheroes. They are humans, and they are victims. They need support and protection now more than ever. Will you listen to their calls as my brother, Dr. Yunus Al-Khatib, end his statement by saying, are you listening to them? They want justice. Are you listening to them? In Masafir Yatta and in Gaza, in Nablus and in Jenin and in Tulkarim, and in Al-Khalil and in Jerusalem and beyond, Palestinians recorded live the crimes committed against them, thinking that if the world sees what Israel is doing, they will hold it accountable. The last evidence is the videotape that I sent to you, Mr. President. There are thousands, maybe tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these videotapes by Palestinians in Gaza documenting crimes against them. And this morning, I was among a group of ambassadors. We listened to Mr. Lazzarini about the situation of UNRWA and other issues. He made an appeal to us. He said, we need international journalists to come and document what is happening in Gaza. Not only to take them with the Israeli army so that the Israeli army to show them what they want to show. Do we have the spine, all of us, the Security Council, all of the European countries, the United States of America, which has the fourth power in its system, which is journalism and the media? Do you have the courage to send journalists to all parts of the Gaza Strip to document what is really happening to the Palestinian people and the genocide that they are being exposed to? Send journalists. That's what Mr. Lazzarini was urging us. The more than 24 ambassadors, most of them are from the European Union. Why aren't we sending journalists to document what is real and what is fake news in the Gaza Strip? And we urge you to add your voices to the demand and to the call of Mr. Lazzarini. Send journalists, send international journalists from the New York Times, from all media, from the BBC, to go and document what is really happening in the Gaza Strip. Now, the Palestinian people, I suppose, they wonder if impunity will ever end, if their lives will ever matter enough to trigger an appropriate reaction. This despair was reflected recently by a child shouting after the bombing of his house at a man filming him. What the hell are you filming? What for? Nobody is looking at us. Do you want the Palestinian people, the message to resonate deeper and deeper in their heads that the world is abandoning them, that the international community is abandoning them, that the Security Council is abandoning them? You see their images, their broken lives, their blood, their tears, their remains. These images move you. I know they do. But what matters to Palestinians is that they make you move. Not only to move you, but move. Resort to action. Do something. Stop this tragedy. Stop the killing of the Palestinians. Stop the firing. Demand a ceasefire, permanent ceasefire now, as you have decided in many resolutions, including Resolution 2735, and including the agreement, which was brokered by the United States of America, the current administration, few days before the inauguration of President Trump, and Egypt and Qatar. It was an agreement between Israel and Hamas, and those are the guarantors. Implement what you negotiated and you agreed to, and the Security Council reflected it in a Security Council resolution, the essence of it, 2735. You see their images, as I said, their broken lives, their blood, their tears, their remains. These images move you. I know they do, but what matters to Palestinians is that they make you move. They need to make governments across the world dare to do all the things they are still unwilling to do to bring this nightmare, this catastrophe to an end. Enough occupation and wars, enough suffering, enough bloodshed. We need ceasefire now. Support to the Arab reconstruction plan, concrete and decisive measures adopted at the International Conference on the Peace Settlement of the Question of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution to be held in June and co-chaired by Saudi Arabia and France. The Council must clearly support such an immediate ceasefire in line with its Resolution 2735. It must support reconstruction, freedom, and peace in line with its mandate. Let life prevail. Let justice, freedom, and peace prevail. Let two states live side by side. Let all civilians be safe. Let our region unleash its true potential with shared peace, security, and prosperity. Yunus and Basil and so many others are doing their part. They need you to do yours. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie Monsieur l'Observateur permanent de l'État observateur de Palestine. Votre vidéo est mise à la disposition des missions du Conseil de sécurité. Et je donne maintenant la parole à Monsieur le représentant permanent d'Israël.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me start with my conclusion for our last debate. This war will not end until the 59 remaining innocent hostages are released and Hamas is driven from Gaza. Yet, every few days, this council convenes again to address the situation in Gaza, and every time the same pattern unfolds. Hamas commits an atrocity, Israel takes action to defend ourselves, and somehow the story that gets told in this room is upside down. Allow us to set the record straight. Take the incident on March 23 concerning the Red Crescent. Inside those vehicles, which are supposed to save lives, were active Hamas terrorists. 9 terrorists were eliminated, including Muhammad Amin Ibrahim Shubaki, a Hamas terrorist who directly took part in the October 7th massacre. I ask you, Mr. El-Khatib, what he was doing there? What he was doing in an ambulance, a Hamas terrorist who was in Israel on October 7th? Why he was connected to that? What is the connection between humanitarian work and terrorists of Hamas? Israel mourns the loss of innocent life wherever it takes place. We especially mourn the loss of any humanitarian workers. There must be, however, a reframing of the approach this Council and humanitarian agencies are taking. How did 9 Hamas terrorists find themselves traveling inside Red Crescent ambulances in the middle of the night? The presence of those terrorists puts everyone's lives at risk. If we really want to protect civilians and humanitarian workers, the vetting system of such organization must improve immediately. Otherwise, we will find more taxpayer money in the pockets of terrorists and more innocent lives in danger. As I have said, we are investigating all of those incidents, and we respect the work of UN personnel. However, this Council must acknowledge the infiltration of some agencies and their activities by bad actors. A prime example of the need for better vetting was discovered just 2 weeks ago. A UN worker was being treated in Israel, and something deeply disturbing was uncovered. This man had Nazi tattoos across both his arms. On one arm, as you can see, the man had the motto of the SS, a UN employee. On the other arm, the tattoo was the face of an SS soldier wearing a Nazi hat and a collar with Nazi symbols. It's hard to see, but that's what he had on both of his arms. Let me repeat. Underneath a shirt bearing the UN emblem were markings which glorified the Nazis. Who is approving these people? Who is conducting their interviews? The presence of such disgusting symbols on UN personnel should shock every member of this council. So let us be clear. When terrorists operate in active combat zones while using humanitarian vehicles as taxis, we will do whatever it takes to protect our soldiers and our citizens in accordance with our international obligations. That is the price of defending human life in a war Hamas started and refuses to end. Of course, this is not a one-off. It is part of Hamas's system. Just days ago, as some of you mentioned earlier, our forces carried out a precise strike on Hamas terrorists in Jabalia. These terrorists were hiding inside a command and control complex built inside an UNRWA clinic. This terror hub was used by Hamas's Jabalia battalion to plan and coordinate attacks against Israeli civilians and IDF forces. So what you do when you have a command center of terrorists, you attack them. Our strike was deliberate, intelligence-based operation. Prior to the strike, many steps were taken to reduce the chance of harming civilians, including aerial observation and additional intelligence verification. But the truth is, this council simply cannot relate to the complexity of the situation Israel faces. We are facing a terrorist organization that carried out the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, raping, murdering, and burning entire families alive. And today they continue to hold our people in tunnels, subjecting them to torture, starvation, and psychological torment. They promise to commit these atrocities again and again and again. Not only that, but Hamas's entire strategy depends on the Council reacting exactly as it is. They steal ATRACs. They launch rockets from hospitals and UN facilities. They mobilize in ambulances. Today, ask yourselves, how they go from one place to another? You can testify to that. Sometimes they force themselves, sometimes they infiltrate the organization, but they don't move with taxis, no Uber, no military. They use ambulances and UN vehicles. They exploit humanitarian infrastructure as a shield because they know this council will rush to blame Israel for responding. Hamas has studied the United Nations and built its war plan based on the UN's moral confusion. Once again, we are seeing this tactic play out. The UN didn't wait for an investigation for any of the incidents discussed today. It did not wait for verified evidence. It didn't check the facts. It rushed to the microphones to condemn Israel before knowing anything at all, while ignoring the terrorist organization using its resources for evil. There is no other country on earth subjected to this kind of treatment. So many of the actions and statements here are political theater. They are not out of concern for the well-being of Gazans, because if that was truly the priority, we would be discussing the mass anti-Hamas protests taking place inside Gaza. In the past weeks, tens of thousands of Palestinians have taken to the streets, not to protest Israel, but to protest Hamas. In Jabalia, Rafah, Khan Yunis, Gaza City. Allow me to share with you the sounds filling the streets of Gaza over the past 48 hours. It will be in Arabic, so I welcome you to listen to the translator. In this audio, you can hear the incredible bravery of some Gazans, bravery which so many in this building are lacking. These brave people are chanting, Hamas itla bara, 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 bara. Hamas go out, 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 out. You can imagine how Hamas responded. Not with dialogue, not with reform, not by releasing our hostages and ending the war, but with public executions and torture. Uday al-Rubia, a 22-year-old from Gaza City, was kidnapped, beaten with iron rods, and dragged through the streets with a rope around his neck. What was his crime? Speaking out, organizing peaceful protests, demanding a future without Hamas. He was returned to his family moments before his death, broken and lifeless. Still, the mourners at Uday's funeral shouted in defiance against Hamas. Again, they shouted. Another brave young man, Hussam al-Majdalawi, was shot in the legs and abandoned in Nuseirat Square. Mr. Mansour, these two young men, Uday and Hussam, have shown more bravery than you ever have. You speak here every time. For years, you still cannot bring yourself to even mention Hamas, let alone condemn them. How many times you have spoken in this council, but you cannot mention Hamas, you cannot tell them the truth. I ask you here and now, can you show some of the bravery of those young demonstrators? Can you condemn Hamas? Can you say Hamas itla bara, 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 out, out, out? By your shameful silence, you stand with Hamas. By your shameful silence, you stand against the people of Gaza. By your shameful silence, you desecrate the UN Charter and its values. This Council and the entire UN has a choice to make. You can continue shielding Hamas under the cover of neutrality, or you can finally listen to the people of Gaza and support their cries for liberation from Hamas. You spoke about occupation of Gaza. I'm telling you here, and it's recorded, we have no intention to stay in Gaza. We left Gaza in 2005, completely. We didn't leave one community, not one soldier. We took out the cemeteries from Gaza. We left 20 years ago. We have no desire to go back. Distinguished colleagues, Israel will continue to defend its people. We will continue to take every measure possible to protect civilians and humanitarian workers, and we mourn every innocent life lost. However, We will never allow Hamas to rebuild under the false cover of human rights. Those days are long gone. We will not apologize for striking terrorist commanders. We will not hesitate to dismantle Hamas's terror machine, piece by piece, neighborhood by neighborhood, until the threat is gone. That is not our right. It is our obligation to our people, to our children, and to our future. Before I conclude, this war will not end on the UN's timeline. It will end when the 59 remaining hostages are released and Hamas is removed from power. There is no easy solution to a terrorist problem. There is no ceasefire agreement that can hold while innocent people remain in captivity. We are dealing with a vicious, sophisticated enemy with no red lines, no limits, no value for human life. We will do all that is necessary to defeat this dark force. We will act with determination until we bring back our hostages, every single one of them. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie Monsieur le représentant permanent d'Israël pour sa déclaration et je donne la parole à Monsieur le représentant permanent de Libye.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President.
أتقدم بهذا البيان باسم المجموعة العربية وأشكركم على تلبية دعوة الجزائر الممثل العربي
للمجلس
لعقد هذا الاجتماع الهام كما أشكر السيد فولكان ترك والدكتور يونس الخطيب على إحاطتهما والتي توضح حجم المأساة وتدهور الأوضاع التي فاقت جميع المقاييس. نتحدث إليكم اليوم وقد وصلت الأزمة ذروتها حتى لم يعد يجدي إعداد البيانات واختيار الكلمات فأصبحنا نتحدث لكم بما نشعر به عن ظهر قلب ولا داعي لإقناعكم بحجم الانتهاكات والمجازر التي تقترف كل يوم وعلى مدى أكثر من 15 شهراً وحتى الآن. اليوم استمعتم إلى شهادة الدكتور الخطيب من قلب مجزرة أخرى اقترفتها قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي بقتلها وبدم بارد. وكما اعترفوا اليوم قتلوا طواقم
Admitted today, they have killed teams for the Red Crescent and Civil Defense and the UN under the pretext that there are Hamas fighters among them. A massacre that was committed deliberately, and afterwards the bodies were thrown in a mass grave in an attempt to obliterate and hide what was done. Another crime added to a series of crimes against humanitarian workers which has claimed more than 600 humanitarians, including media personnel. When you ask Dr. Riyad, why don't we have journalists from other countries that come? Of course, they will be accused of joining Hamas and they will be killed. We have listened today to the calls for a transparent and independent investigation into this matter. The question, what happened to previous calls for similar investigations and where are the results of those investigations? Unfortunately, nothing has been done. Mr. President, these testimonies are but a sample of stories, events, and the systematic campaign against our people in Gaza and the West Bank, not just now, but for decades. And focusing on just what's happening in Gaza and throwing all the blame on Hamas, we ask about the West Bank. What about the events in the West Bank before October 7th? This campaign of blockade, starvation, and the bombardment of women and children is another evidence of the approach and method of genocide by the occupation in full impunity, as everyone listens and watches. Everything is being communicated live, broadcast live. What would you do about it all? The most recent of those violations was was desecrating Al-Aqsa Mosque yesterday by the so-called Minister of National Security of Israel in another attempt to provoke everyone. And the Arab group condemns in the strongest terms these provocations, and these would not be of any avail. It will only increase the tension. And when there is a natural reaction to this, those who are the victims will be accused, and people will forget who perpetrated such acts. Their group, since the first day, has worked to work with all countries and the members of the Council, the most recent of which was communication with you, Mr. President, yesterday or the day before yesterday, and with the E10, and we are still working on this track to find an exit from this crisis and a solution so that we can relate the facts and find practical solutions to end these massacres immediately. The Arab group, and through the Arab Summit recent statement in the extraordinary summit held in Cairo, we have spoken in one voice against these violations, and we have spoken to the need for an immediate ceasefire and ending any attempt for forced displacement and the need to deliver humanitarian aid immediately. This position is not just the position of the Arab group, it is the position of the Islamic group and the free world. These actions committed put this council before a historic responsibility, and with the inability to have any council product would be a disgrace that will be remembered by history for decades. It is time to act now. Immediately. The Arab group has supported the ceasefire agreement that was reached by the mediation of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States. This agreement was something that we all found as an optimistic element, and this agreement was being implemented seamlessly in the first phase. However, this agreement was violated by the intransigence of the Israeli side, and the reason was political by the government of occupation to guarantee its continued aggression, riding roughshod over any attempts to end this. The Arab group has supported the ceasefire agreement, and we have also welcomed the effort of the U.S. and the new U.S. administration that has sought truly in January to implement this ceasefire, which was successful at the beginning. The question is, what went differently and why did this end? We ask the U.S. administration to continue its negotiation with Qatar and Egypt to implement this agreement. Mr. President, in closing, the Arab group thinks that the Security Council needs to work to support the following 3 points. First, work to adopt the Security Council resolution immediately that would end this aggression and call for a comprehensive and full ceasefire. Further, call for delivery of humanitarian aid without interruption. 3, the resumption of negotiations on the phases of the agreement to end the dossier of those detained and the hostages and the prisoners. Further, support for the conference by Cairo next month on the reconstruction of Gaza, which will be held in coordination with the Palestinian Authority and the United Nations. Third, support for the conference that will be held under the chairmanship of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and France next June on the discussion on the two-state solution. Ladies and gentlemen, what we are living through today is not something that we can be silent vis-a-vis any further. You are being tested by history. Either you stand the test of history and you support the rules of international humanitarian law and human rights law, or you are accomplices in silence in this genocide against the people of Palestine. However, history and the annals of history are recording, and this will be on everyone's shoulder. This is not just the responsibility of Arab and Islamic states, it is the responsibility of the entire world. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie Monsieur le représentant
I thank the permanent representative of Libya,
et je donne la parole
and I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine, who has asked to make a further statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I do respect the ruling of the President in maintaining decorum in the meetings of the Security Council. Having said that, I don't think the speaker on this other side has the credibility to judge others about bravery and coward behavior, the one that his government and his forces, the one that their hands are dripping with the blood of tens of thousands of Palestinians, including 17,000 plus children, do not have the moral authority to judge anyone. And I respect our people immensely, including on the Gaza Strip. They are the ones who judge Palestinians' leaders, not those who are killing them and killing their children and women and destroying their houses over their heads. And it would be the appropriate thing for such a representative to review the conduct in his own house about their activities, which are now taking place in their own courts, about their corruptions and their relationship, in addition to the fact that the Prime Minister of that occupying authority is considered by the ICC as a war criminal, and he is being sought to appear in front of the International Court of Justice for the crimes committed against the Palestinian people. So those who live in houses of glasses should not throw stones at others. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank
the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine, and I give the floor to the permanent representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will continue and remind you, Mr. Mansour, we are not your enemy. Your enemies are Hamas. The day that you will have the courage, the strength, the bravery to face the radicals of Hamas, you can speak about the future for the Palestinians. But as long as you will continue to blame Israel for everything, you will be here, or somebody else will be here, attacking Israel. There will be no future for your people, no future for the region. The enemy of the Palestinian people are the radicals who started the war against Israel on October 7th, and the radicals you are even afraid to mention their name or to condemn them. That is your problem.
I
thank the permanent representative of Israel. I give the floor to the permanent observer of Palestine for his final statement.
I apologize, Mr. President, for going through this episode. But let me just say to the representative of the occupying authority, when you stop killing our children and our people in this unprecedented number, like in the Gaza Strip, and imprisoning since 1967, as I said before, 1 million Palestinians, then there will be a chance for me to believe you. But when your conduct is like that, you cannot even convince a child among the Palestinian people that you mean well for the Palestinian people. End the killing, end the occupation, pave the way for ending this occupation, to have two-state solution, living side by side, then there will be an opening for peace. But your conduct does not qualify you to be a partner. We don't have a partner for peace from your side. Clean your act through action, not through empty words. Then you might qualify to be a peace partner. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent observer of Palestine, and I give the floor to the permanent representative of Israel for his final statement.
I will keep it very short, Mr. President. On October 6th, we had a ceasefire. On October 6th, it was peaceful in Israel, it was peaceful in Gaza. Thank you very much.
Je remercie le représentant permanent
d'Israël. I thank the permanent representative of Israel.
Il n'y a plus d'orateurs inscrits sur la liste.
There are no further speakers inscribed on the list. The meeting is adjourned.
Vinny Hesat.